The Turnpike House by Fergus Hume, Part 2, Chapter 16. Jenny Braun makes a discovery. The next day, Mr. Cass informed Ruth that Geoffrey Heron was coming to spend a few days at Hollyoaks. He made no attempt to conceal his reason for asking the young man. "It is necessary," he said, "that I should talk over this deplorable matter with him. Anything further that has to be done in connection with the possible release of Mrs. Jenner must be done through me. I am her oldest friend. I am her son's best friend, and I have a right to bring the matter to a creditable issue. Do you not agree with me?" He looked at her keenly. "Yes, Papa, I do," she replied, feeling more at ease in her mind now that she saw he did not shirk the investigation. "I only wish I had told you before. But you must do me the justice to own that I never expected to find you in any way connected with it. The wonder is that you did not find me mixed up in it earlier," he said. "I have had so much to do with Mrs. Jenner and her son that I could hardly help being concerned in their trouble. But you need not worry about me, child. I am quite able to protect myself and to explain, when the time comes, how that broken link came to be lost. If you will only do that. Ruth, is it possible that you believe your father guilty of this crime?" "Oh, no, I do not. But—" He turned away. "Well, say no more about it," he said in a softer tone than was usual with him, for he saw that the girl was terribly troubled. "There is, on the face of it, some ground for you to doubt me. I do not for a moment deny that such is the case. But I hope to right myself in your eyes. Still, you must give me time to consider the matter." "You are not angry with me, then?" she asked, anxiously. "I am displeased that you should have undertaken this investigation without telling me your intention. But I can forgive you, for I know how impulsive you are. Let us say no more about it. My task is to get at the truth of this matter, and with Geoffrey's assistance I hope to do so. All I ask is that you should be silent and leave things in my hands, and never conceal anything from me again." "I will do all you say," replied his daughter, and kissed him. In due time Geoffrey arrived. He was in high spirits and brought the best of news from Bognor. Neil was mending rapidly and would soon be on his feet again. Since he had found a friend and brother in Geoffrey, he had become much less morbid, and was beginning to take quite a cheerful view of life. If his mother could only be proved innocent and set at liberty, he would have little left to wish for. As for Ruth, his love for her had by some strange mental process been obliterated during his illness, and he rose from his sickbed with nothing more than a strong feeling of friendship for the girl who had so recently been all the world to him. And indeed, when Miss Cass came to hear of this, she was not over well pleased. But it was not long before she blamed herself for her vanity, and reminded herself that this was quite the best thing that could have happened to her former lover. After dinner, Mr. Cass carried Geoffrey off to the library. He particularly wanted to have a few words alone with him, he said. Heron had not the least idea what the subject of their talk was to be, Mr. Cass having merely invited him to spend a few days at Hollyoaks, saying he had an important subject to discuss with him. And it had passed through Geoffrey's mind that Ruth must have confided in her father their tacit engagement. He was a good deal astonished, therefore, when Mr. Cass abruptly informed him that the matter referred to was that of the Jenner murder. "Why, Mr. Cass," exclaimed the young man, "how do you know about that? And what do you know?" "Ruth told me that you were interesting yourself in it," was the reply, "and I know all that she could tell me. I was not very pleased to find that she had been getting mixed up in the affair. It was her own wish," Heron said. "I did not like it myself, and I should have been the last person in the world to tell her anything about it. But after all, it was but the curiosity of a young girl. No one can blame her. No one can blame any woman for being curious," Mr. Cass said drily. "All the same, feminine curiosity can do a lot of mischief when it is not properly directed, as in this instance. Will you please to tell me, Heron, exactly how Ruth found it out?" Not knowing that Mr. Cass wished to compare his story with Ruth's, Geoffrey willingly consented, and informed him of Ruth's visit to Mrs. Gent, and how the outcome of it all, so far as he was concerned, had been his discovery of the fact that Ruth was willing to marry him. "And that is, after all, what I care most about," he said, with a happy look in his eyes. "I am very glad of it," Mr. Cass said soberly. "I always wanted her to marry you. I think you will be able to control her. I was afraid at one time that she would have run away with Webster." "I don't think that he would have run away with her," replied Geoffrey. He decided to give her up when he learnt the secret of his parentage. Now he has got over his love and is quite willing that she should marry me. Poor Neil. He has had a bad time. That could not have been prevented. I did my best to spare him the knowledge of his mother's fate. She asked me to make her the promise, and I did so. Do you think she is guilty? I really can't say, replied Mr. Cass with some hesitation. When she was arrested, I implored her to defend herself if she could, but she obstinately refused to open her mouth. She certainly never told me that Neil had killed his father. Do you believe he did? No, certainly not. I believe the child got up from his bed in a dazed condition on suddenly waking out of the trance. He came into the room and found his father lying dead with a knife on the floor beside him. Naturally enough, the child picked up the knife. Then, no doubt, his reason became unsettled, added to which the cold to which he was exposed that night when his mother fled was altogether too much for him, and he fell seriously ill. He remembers nothing of all that, Heron said. I asked him myself. He remembers his childhood up to the time his mother put him to bed that night, or rather, I should say, up to the time when he struck at his father with a knife. His memory recommences from the time of his recovery from the illness which followed, but the interval is a blank. Of course, he might have seen the assassin, but I am sure, continued Heron firmly, that his mother is not the guilty person. She denies having committed the murder, and says she was silent on Neil's account. Does she suspect anyone? Asked Mr. Cass, and Heron noticed that he did not give an opinion as to her guilt or innocence. No, she cannot think who did it. I asked her about the links, or rather about the part of one which Ruth found under the window. I suppose. She told you of her discovery? Yes, she did. By the way, have you the link with you? Heron took it out of his pocketbook and laid it on the table. It is a curious one, he said. The pattern is an odd one and not in very good taste. Oh, I don't know, Mr. Cass said with studied carelessness. I have seen the same kind of thing. They were in vogue some years ago. Each oval has a different design on it: a ballet girl, a bottle, a horse, and a pack of cards. They were known as the Fervices. What does Mrs. Jenner say about this? She cannot think who can have worn them. She says she never saw such a set before. Had Geoffrey Heron been an observant man, he would have seen a distinct expression of relief pass over the face of his host. But he remarked nothing, and Mr. Cass went on. It is possible the person who killed Jenner may have dropped it, he said, but I am afraid it is but a slight clue after all these years. Besides, if Mrs. Jenner cannot guess the motive for the crime, I don't see how we can. She thinks the motive was fear of blackmail on the part of the assassin, said Geoffrey. Ah, said the merchant significantly. I am not astonished. Jenner was a clerk in my office, and as thorough a blackguard as ever walked. He was exactly the man who would have blackmailed another if he could have done so with safety. But what reason has Mrs. Jenner for thinking this? Because her husband had boasted to her that in a red pocketbook which he flourished in her face, he had the materials for getting money. Now, that pocketbook was not produced at the trial. I see, said Mr. Cass, his chin on his hand. You think the murderer stabbed Jenner as he stood by the window, stole the pocketbook, and had his link wrenched off in the struggles? That is the only way in which I can account for the crime. It seems feasible enough, replied the merchant musingly. But I do not see how I can help you to trace the man. After Jenner left my office, I saw very little of him. If Mrs. Jenner cannot tell whom it was he intended to blackmail, no one else can. She does not know Mr. Cass. Her husband gave her no hint. All he said was that he could make money out of what he had in that pocketbook. She held her tongue, as you know, for her son's sake. Now she sees that it was wrong. But she did it for the best. I suppose she did, said Mr. Cass, giving the link back to Heron. But I wish she had spoken out when I asked her. I could not induce her to be frank. She merely declared that she was prepared to suffer. Well, Mr. Cass rose to his feet. I don't think there is anything more to be said, Heron. But how are we to continue the search? Leave it in my hands for the moment. I will see Mrs. Jenner, and between the two of us, seeing we knew Jenner better than anyone else, we may find out who it was he intended to blackmail. If that should fail, I really don't know what to suggest. Well, I will wait till you have seen her, Geoffrey said, and went off to bed. He rose early and was out walking up and down the terrace before breakfast. Ruth was not down, but he could see Jenny Braun playing with little George Chisel and Ethel. Mildred was not visible, but in a few minutes he found her seated in a disconsolate attitude on the steps. "What is the matter?" he asked, for he was fond of children. "It's Aunt Ruth," said the child tearfully. "She won't give me back my doll's brooch." "Oh, I'll ask her to give it back." "What is it like?" He asked the question carelessly, little dreaming of what the answer would be, nor guessing the consequences which would ensue. "It's a gold brooch, with a horse on it, a dear little horse." Even then it did not enter his mind that the brooch referred to had any connection with the links of which he had spoken to his host the night before. "How big was it?" he asked. "If Aunt Ruth won't give it back, I'll try and get you one like it." "Oh, I think Grandfather will give me another," Mildred said hopefully. "He gave me this. It is this size." She drew a small oval in the dust with her finger, and that shape with a horse on it in pretty colors and a little thing on the back to put a thread through so that my doll can wear it. "It is so pretty." Heron felt as if he had received a blow. For was not the child describing, with the exception of the design, the broken link he had in his pocket? And she had got it from her grandfather. Without a word, he took the link out of his pocket and shooed it to the child. She pounced on it with a scream of delight. "Why, that's my brooch," she cried. And then on a nearer view, "No, it isn't. Here's a nasty bottle. Mine had a horse on it." The young man remembered the description given by Mr. Cass of the links, known as the Forvices, and he could no longer refuse to believe that it was he who had given Mildred the link which matched the one now in her hands. And that link had been found under the window of the very room in which the crime had been committed. Could it be possible? "No, no," cried Geoffrey, staggering back, his ruddy face pale. "It cannot be. What is the matter, Mr. Heron? Are you ill?" asked the child, rising. "No, I am not ill, dear. But give me back my brooch." "I don't like it," she said, thrusting it into his hand. "A nasty bottle? Mine with the horse was much nicer. I'll ask Grandfather to give me another. Now I'm going to play, Mr. Heron. Do ask Aunt Ruth to give me back my dear little brooch." The prattle of the child worried him terribly. "Yes, yes," he said impatiently. "But run away and play now, dear." And as Mildred scampered off, great heavens, he thought. Can Cass have murdered the man? Impossible. He could have had no motive. He was thankful to be alone, for he felt that in his present state of mind he could speak to no one. Therefore, still thinking of the new discovery he had made, he felt annoyed to see Jenny Braun leave the children and come towards him. He would have escaped her by walking off, but she called to him, and he had perforce to remain. She looked anxious and worried. "Mr. Heron, I wish to speak to you particularly," she said. "I am so glad to find you alone. You look ill." "I have had rather a shock, but really I am all right," he said, with an attempt at a smile. "What is it, Miss Braun?" "Well," she said, "it is a somewhat curious story. You know, Ruth brought back with her a toy horse which she put into a drawer in her bedroom. She gave the children permission to open the drawer, and there they found the horse. George took possession of it and hid it away. Well, he produced the animal the other day, pulled it out of its hiding place, and proceeded to cut it open to see what was the matter with it," he said. "I was in the room and watched him without paying much attention. If I had had my wits about me, I should have recognized Ruth's horse and would not have allowed him to touch it. But, however, he did so and pulled out all the stuffing. I saw that he was making a mess on the carpet and went to stop him. Then I found among the stuffing a paper with your name on it. I waited for an opportunity of giving it to you, and here it is." And Jenny put into his hand a bill of exchange, old, discolored, and crumpled. Hardly knowing what he was doing, Heron glanced at the document and saw that his father's signature, Geoffrey Heron, was written across the bill, while the signature at the foot was that of Frank Marshall. Chapter 17. Heron follows the trail. Ruth could not rid herself of a haunting doubt that her father knew more of the Jenner murder than he chose to confess. If he himself had not killed the man in a fit of impetuous rage, and the girl could not bring herself to think this, he knew who had struck the fatal blow. Ruth was certain now that Mrs. Jenner was innocent, notwithstanding the fact that she had been found guilty. This being so, she argued to herself that if her father were aware of the truth, he should at once take steps to remedy the grave miscarriage of justice which had taken place. But as he made no move, Ruth, perplexed and doubtful, became quite ill with suspense. It was no wonder then that Geoffrey had found her poor company, and had failed to understand her constant melancholy. Under these circumstances, he had taken his departure, wondering what had befallen the house, which had formerly been so bright and pleasant. But no satisfaction was to be had either from Mr. Cass or from his daughter. On arriving at his own place, he went at once to the library to look for some document with his father's signature in order to compare it with that on the bill. And after a close inspection of some half-dozen autographs of the late Mr. Heron, he came to the conclusion that the signature to the bill was a forgery. Once convinced of this, he began to see daylight and argued out the case that evening, alone and undisturbed. Jenner was at one time a clerk in the firm of Cass and Marshall, he thought. Therefore, he must have known Marshall very well. He was dismissed and so had no cause to love his employers. Mr. Cass, so far as I know, was always an upright man, and Jenner had no chance of injuring him in any way. With Marshall, the case was different. If I remember rightly, Mrs. Jenner told me that her husband and Marshall were as thick as thieves, the master patronizing the clerk on account of the man's beautiful voice and musical accomplishments. Marshall, too, lived a gay life and was given to spending pretty freely. It is quite possible that he might have made use of Jenner as a tool to get more money through this bill. £500, said Geoffrey, looking at the document in question. Humph, just the sum he might require for an emergency. He turned over the bill and found it endorsed by Julius Roper. Ah, he went on, where have I heard that name? Roper, I am sure someone spoke of Roper. Suddenly, it flashed into his mind that Roper was the moneylender in whose employment Jenner had been after he had failed on the stage. The bill was discounted in the office in which Jenner was employed, he thought with growing excitement, for the matter was becoming more interesting every minute, and Jenner, knowing it was forged, stole it from Roper. He meant to use it as a means of extorting blackmail. Ah! He stopped short. Blackmail? It was of that he boasted to his wife this, then, was the material for getting money that he said he had in the red pocketbook. The pocketbook has disappeared. But the bill, humph! How did it get inside the horse? Could Jenner himself have put it there? If so, why? What was his reason? I must see Mrs. Jenner and ask her. Between the two of us, we may get at the truth. But although he was satisfied that his father's signature had been forged, he could not be absolutely certain that Marshall had been the forger. He had drawn the bill, it was true, but Jenner might have counterfeited the signature and have assisted Marshall to get the money. Then Geoffrey recollected that his father, a particularly precise man, had been in the habit of keeping a diary in which he was accustomed to set down the most trivial details of his somewhat uninteresting life. No sooner had this thought struck him than he went to a certain press and pulled out the series of little books which contained these entries. Glancing at the date of the bill, he set to work and after an hour's search found the evidence. The late Mr. Heron had made no attempt to conceal Marshall's rascality, for it was plainly set down that a certain Mr. Roper had called upon him to shew a bill of exchange and to ask if the signature were his. Mr. Heron had replied that he had never signed a bill in his life, whereupon Roper had intimated that the bill had been presented by Frank Marshall and that the money had been paid to him. Roper had also expressed his intention of having Marshall arrested, but to this Mr. Heron had objected. Bad as he thought the man, he wanted to avoid any serious trouble, less for Marshall's own sake than for that of Miss Inez Cass, to whom he was engaged and who was deeply in love with him. Roper had left the house with the avowed intention of making things hot for him. So Mr. Heron had called on Marshall at his house near Hollyoake and told him what had happened. Then Marshall had confessed that, being in want of money, he had forged Mr. Heron's name. But he stated that he was going to pay the money back to Roper very shortly, and he implored Mr. Heron to take no steps against him. It would break Miss Cass's heart, he said, and Mr. Heron, pitying Inez and having a great respect for her brother, had promised to say no more about it, and had agreed to refrain from assisting Roper on condition that the £500 were repaid. This, as a later entry in the diary proved, had been done. After that, there was no further mention of the matter. Well, Geoffrey said to himself, as he put away the books, all this is quite plain. It seems that Mr. Frank Marshall is a pretty scoundrel. Oh, there is no doubt that this bill is the blackmailing document referred to by Jenner. Now, I wonder if Marshall murdered him to get possession of it. But if he did, the bill would not have been concealed in the toy horse. Ah, no doubt Marshall thought it was in the red pocketbook, and stole that after he had killed him. That was why the pocketbook disappeared. Probably Marshall himself destroyed it. Humph! I have gone so far with very good results. Now, before I can proceed further, I must see Mrs. Jenner and Roper. I wonder if that scoundrel is still alive. Next day, Geoffrey paid a visit to the jail where Mrs. Jenner was serving her life sentence. After some difficulty, he was permitted to see the prisoner. Indeed, he might not have procured the interview at all had he not told the governor that he saw a good chance of proving the woman innocent. The governor was a humane man, and, anxious that justice should be done, he stretched a point and allowed Heron to see her with as much privacy as was compatible with prison discipline. As soon as they were alone, Heron related all that he had discovered, and then proceeded to ask his questions. Mrs. Jenner, poor woman, became much excited, and small wonder, seeing that for the first time she saw a chance of regaining her freedom. But after all, it will be to die, Mr. Heron, she said sadly. I am very ill. Trouble, exposure, and mental worry have been too much for me. The doctor saw me 2 days ago, and has ordered my removal to the infirmary. Geoffrey looked at her, and, true enough, there was death in her face. A few weeks were all of life left to her now. And yet on hearing Geoffrey's news, the bold spirit flamed up again in her for the last time. I'm sure you are right, Mr. Heron, she said feverishly. Mr. Marshall is the guilty person. He was always a scamp and a rake. There is no doubt that it was for the purpose of blackmailing him that my husband came down to Westham on the night he was murdered. In fact, he said as much to me at the Turnpike House. Do you know that he had met Marshall on that very night? No, you did not tell me that. I forgot. Besides, I really did not think it mattered. I did not expect that Mr. Marshall would be brought into the affair. He was always cunning enough to look after himself. At that time, he was engaged to marry Miss Cass, and she loved him with the fierceness of a tigress. Do you mean the present Mrs. Marshall? Who else should I mean? She always loved him. He had a strange fascination for women. Why, I don't know, for he was not particularly good-looking or attractive. But Miss Inez loved him, and it was within 2 months of the murder that they were married. I was in prison then, as I am now, and under sentence of death. Then you think that Marshall killed your husband? I do, she said, with a look of hatred in her large blue eyes. I feel certain of it. Look at the motive he had. He was engaged to marry Miss Inez Cass. She was rich, and he needed money. Then again, there was some talk of his leaving the firm. I believe myself that Mr. Cass was quite tired of the way he was going on. I wonder that Mr. Cass, knowing him as he did not forbid the marriage. What would have been the use? His sister was her own mistress. She had her own money, a large fortune, and she was madly in love with Marshall. She would have done anything for him. She simply groveled at his feet. Her infatuation was the talk of all Westham at the time I was starving at the Turnpike House. Extraordinary, mused Geoffrey. She is so masterful a woman that I wonder she could have fallen in love with so weak a man. It is one of those things in which a woman's nature is stronger than her principles, said Mrs. Jenner. Besides, he was fascinating, and she was no longer a young woman, she added, with a touch of feminine spite. At any rate, she was delighted when he fell in love with her, and determined not to let him go. Was he in love with her? No, perhaps I was wrong to put it that way. No doubt he wanted her money. Did he leave the firm? Yes, shortly after his marriage. Ah, then depend upon it, Mr. Cass got rid of him. He married Miss Cass for her money. He must have been in great straits when he committed that forgery. Oh, I quite believe it was he who did it. He was wonderfully clever at imitating handwriting. I knew of that accomplishment long before I was married. How you hate him! Geoffrey could not help exclaiming. I am a very good hater, she said quietly, and I have every reason to hate that man. It was he who got my husband dismissed, and it was certainly he who led him in dissipated ways. For Jenner was not a bad man during the early years of our married life. It was only when he came under Marshall's influence that he took to drink and began to treat me cruelly. Oh, I know what I owe him only too well. I should like to see him arrested for this murder. And hanged. She spoke with such vehemence that Heron shivered. I hope he will be proved innocent for all that, he said. Remember, I am engaged to his niece. Miss Ruth is not his niece save by marriage. Still, the disgrace. Well, leave the matter alone, said Mrs. Jenner abruptly. I have suffered so much that a little, more or less, does not matter. When I am gone, there will be an end of all your trouble. Let Marshall live to repent if he can. I am willing to die with the disgrace on me. I can't well be worse off than I am, and my son will soon forget me. You do him wrong, Mrs. Jenner. He loves you dearly. But, let this be as it may, what I have to do is to get at the truth of it all. If Marshall will confess his guilt, I will consult with Mr. Cass and see what is to be done. I confess that on Ruth's account, I do not want a scandal. Would you desert her? No, for I love her, and I am too just, I hope, to visit the sins of other people upon her innocent head. Mrs. Jenner seemed to be considering. Then, Mr. Heron, she said at last, you are a good man. Leave the matter where it stands, and let me die a guilty woman in the eyes of the world. If I were in good health, I might speak differently, but I am dying. Let me die. I have suffered so much that now I could not even enjoy freedom. There is no rest for me but in the grave. Believe me, it is better to leave things as they are. Well, we'll see about that. But tell me, how did the bill get inside the toy horse? Ah, that is difficult to explain. The horse belonged to my boy. He was playing with it before the fire on that evening. I left it there when I took the child to bed. It is likely enough, she went on, musingly, that my husband, knowing he had driven Marshall into a corner, was afraid he might lose this bill. He may have sewn it up inside the horse when I was out of the room. He knew very well that I kept all my boy's toys, and he thought it would be safe there. No one would ever have dreamed of looking for it in such a hiding place. It is really most wonderful, when one comes to think of it, that it has come to light at all. Can you tell me where Jenner met Marshall on that night? No, I cannot. All I know is what he told me, that he had seen him 2 hours before he came to see me. He boasted of his blackmailing. That is all I can tell you. Geoffrey rose. Well, you have given me some information, if not very much, he said. Now I will go and see Roper to make certain how the bill came to be stolen. My husband stole it when he was with Roper, said Mrs. Jenner. And with this last piece of information, Geoffrey departed to follow up the clue. Chapter 18. The Money Lender. Mr. Julian Roper had an establishment in Golden Square, Soho. Although this gentleman was over 80, he had not yet repented of his many iniquities, but callously continued to conduct his evil transactions. His office's 2 dingy rooms were on the ground floor of the house, the apartments overhead being occupied by himself and a crabbed old woman who acted as his housekeeper. The hag was, if possible, worse than her master, and from long years of association, she possessed considerable influence over him. She was a widow, or at least it was as such that she described herself, for her husband had left her many years before in sheer disgust at her tyranny. Mrs. Hutt was her name, and she had a son who acted as clerk to Julian. When Geoffrey Heron arrived at this sordid temple of Mammon, he was received by the drudge, a young old person of no particular age, dressed in a suit of rusty black. He informed the visitor that his master was absent. The clerk, who answered to the name of Jerry Hutt, gave Mr. Heron a broken-back chair and returned to his desk, which was smuggled away into a corner. With a shrug at the poverty of the place and the apparently enfeebled intellect of the person in charge, the young man took a seat and amused himself by taking stock of his surroundings. Jerry took not the slightest notice of Geoffrey after the first greeting. He rode hard with his tongue thrust into his cheek, giving vent at times to a faint chuckle which was positively uncanny. Coming to the conclusion that he was half-witted, Heron came to regard him in the light in which most people saw him, more as an article of furniture than a man. But in this he, in common with the rest of the visitors to that den, was wrong. For underneath his assumed stupidity, Jerry was as sharp as the proverbial needle. Luckily, Heron had not long to wait. In about a quarter of an hour, Jerry raised his big head and looked out of the window. A shuffling step was heard at the door, and a minute later someone came coughing and grumbling along the narrow passage. "Mr. Roper," chuckled Jerry, pointing towards the inner room. "Go in there." Geoffrey, taking no notice of his brusque manner, passed into the back room. It was better lighted and better furnished than the clerk's den. Still, it was sordid enough, and so dirty that the young squire found it necessary to dust with his handkerchief the seat he had chosen. Cleanliness and godliness are both absent from this establishment, thought Mr. Heron. He could hear Roper outside growling at Jerry, but could catch nothing of their conversation. He guessed that it had to do with himself, for shortly Mr. Roper entered the back room with what was meant to be an amiable smile on his mahogany face. In appearance he was the double of his clerk, as thin, as yellow, and even smaller in stature. "Huh, hey," he said, this being the way in which he was accustomed to begin a conversation. "Mr. Heron, Yes, Mr. Geoffrey Heron, quite so. I knew your father. A good man, Mr. Heron, but strong in his expressions." Geoffrey took this to mean, and very rightly too, that his father had expressed himself in no measured terms as to the moneylender's professional transactions. But he made no comment, merely remarking that he had come to see Mr. Roper on business. "Ha! Hey!" chuckled the old man, shuffling towards his desk with the aid of a heavy stick. "Quite so. Not like your father." "Oh dear no. He never borrowed money." "I am not here for that purpose," retorted Mr. Heron haughtily, and the old man, panting for breath, dropped into his chair. "And I can assure you that you are the last person to whom I should come in such circumstances. My business is quite of a different nature." "Huh! Then why do you come here, Mr. Heron?" "I have much to do. I am poor, and money is hard to make." "If your business has nothing to do with money, why come at all?" "Because you are the only person who can assist me." "I do nothing for nothing," croaked Mr. Roper quickly. "If you want anything out of me, you must pay me cash down. You understand? I have had enough of bills." "Mr. Frank Marshall's bill, for 500 included?" asked Geoffrey. The man started and plucked at his nether lip. "Huh! Hey, what do you know about Mr. Marshall, sir?" "Not so much as you can tell me," said Heron significantly. Marshall, muttered Roper. "I don't know him, never heard of him." Geoffrey took a new tack and prepared to go. "In that case, I need not trouble you. My business has to do with Marshall and a forgery." "Wait! Come now, don't hurry," screeched the old man, clawing at Heron's frock coat. "I do begin to remember something of this. I am old, I can't remember as well as I did. Marshall Frank Marshall Cass and Marshall. Yes, of course I know. A forger, your father, quite so." He stopped and looked up sharply. "Well, what is it?" he asked. Geoffrey sat down again. He was beginning to see his way to the successful management of this old gentleman. "It is a long story," he said slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the avaricious face of the usurer. "Let me begin at the beginning. What about a man called Jenner?" Roper gave another screech and was visibly startled. He cast a swift glance at the door behind which, no doubt, the useful Jerry was eavesdropping. "Jenner," he said, recovering himself with an effort, "was a clerk of mine and a blackguard." "The one implies the other," Heron said drily, "if all I have heard of you is true." "Now, sir, don't you come libeling me," whimpered the usurer, still disturbed. "I won't have it. I will bring an action for damages, heavy damages." "Do, Mr. Roper. I should like to see you shown up in court. How many of your transactions will bear the scrutiny of the law?" "I have never broken the law," he roared, with an attempt at dignity which ill became him. "I am a poor man, but honest." "Jenner? Oh, yes, he was murdered, and he deserved to be murdered, the beast." "Who did it?" asked Geoffrey abruptly. For the second time Mr. Roper was visibly disconcerted. "How should I know any more than yourself?" he quavered. "His wife murdered him, of course. He treated her badly, and she served him out. Women always do. Come, Mr. Roper, you are evading my questions. But I have no time to play the fool. I have come to talk to you about that forged bill." Have you got it? Have you got it?" he shrieked, making a dart with one claw at Geoffrey. "Oh, give it to me if you can. I want to see that Marshall in jail with hard labor," he repeated with evident relish. "My dear gentleman, if you can, help me to crush him." "Why?" asked the young man, drawing back. "Because I hate him. I had a daughter. She loved him. But he would not marry her. Oh, dear no. Her father's reputation was too bad for so fine a gentleman. So she died pine away. Mr. Heron, as I am a sinner." Oh, how Jerry felt it. He admired Elsa. He loved her, so did Marshall. His eyes flashed. But he would not marry her, for all that. "She is dead and buried now, a most expensive tomb," he added vaguely. "All marble, most costly. But she was my daughter. I hate to spend good money, but also was my daughter a most expensive tomb? His listener took all this for the senile babble of age. Perhaps it was, for tears stood in the usurer's eyes, those hard eyes which had remained dry, whilst looking upon much deliberately created misery. He wiped them now with snuffy red bandana, and then looked fiercely at his client. "Come," he said, roughly, with a growl as of a beast about to spring. "What about Marshall?" Geoffrey said nothing for the moment, but stared fixedly at the moneylender. "Huh? Hey," said Roper impatiently, and there was a yellow gleam in his eyes. "I am waiting. What about Marshall? I would rather ask you what about Jenner?" "I do nothing for nothing, as I have told you," was the reply. "If you could assist me to punish that wretch, I might perhaps help you. Otherwise, well, I may be able to help you in that." "Oh," said the old man. "And what grudge have you against Marshall?" "I have none, but I have a very good reason for acting as I am doing." "What is your reason?" "That I refuse to tell you. Speak freely to me, or leave the matter alone, my good man. I can do without your assistance." "No, no," cried the usurer with frightful energy. "If Marshall is to get into trouble, I am the man to assist. He broke my Elsa's heart. I wish to be revenged." "What is it you want to know?" "Tell me about Jenner," Heron said curtly. He saw that the old man, moved by the recollection of Marshall's behavior to his daughter, was in the mood to be confidential. He would get all he could out of him before the wind changed. Roper commenced speaking in a hurry, as though in fear that his resolution would fail him. "Jenner was a wretch, a scamp," he said. "He was in my employment before Jerry grew up to assist me. I took him off the streets, and he repaid my kindness by robbing me of the bill of exchange, on which was the forgery of my father's name." "Oh, you know that," he said with a glance of surprise. "Well, I dare say. Your father-worthy man would no doubt tell you." "Yes, Jenner took the bill just when I thought I had Marshall in the palm of my hand." "Ah, that was a blow. I would have given hundreds to have kept that bill, to have lodged Marshall in jail. But when that was gone, I could do nothing. Have you the bill? Do you know where it is? Give it to me. I'll work the matter." "I have not the bill," said Geoffrey deliberately. He saw that the honor of the Cass family would be lost if entrusted to the hands of this man. "The bill was stolen from Jenner's dead body," he added with studied equivocation. "By whom?" Roper asked abruptly. "Do you not know?" "Certainly not," he said with violence. "Are you about to accuse me of the crime?" "Why, I do not even know of the place where he met his death." "You can prove nothing against me, sir, however cleverly you lay your trap." "I'm not laying any trap," Geoffrey said mildly. "I want to know something more about Jenner, as I have told you at least 5 times. He was in your employment, you say?" "Yes, I took him off the streets. One day Marshall brought that bill. I discounted it and gave him £500. Then I found out how. It does not matter that your father's signature had been forged. I saw your father. I know all about that interview. You saw my father, and he refused to prosecute. Did he not?" "He did, but I would have prosecuted myself, and would have called your father as a witness. Well, I came back after that visit and placed the bill in my safe. Then I told my housekeeper all about it. Jenner must have listened. Shortly afterwards he disappeared. I made a search to see if he had taken anything. Then I found that the bill had gone, that Marshall had escaped me. I managed to set the police on Jenner's track, and he was arrested. I offered not to prosecute if he would give me back the bill, but he refused. Then I prosecuted him for stealing my money, and he got 3 years. When he came out, I believe he went down to the country to see his wife, and she murdered him. What became of the bill, I never could discover. He must have destroyed it." "It is possible," said Heron. "I suppose that the bill was valuable to Marshall as well as to you. No doubt he paid Jenner to destroy it, or else he murdered Jenner to obtain possession of it," the old man said gloomily. "But no, Mrs. Jenner killed him. I was at the trial. I heard all the evidence. Nothing could have been clearer or fairer. She killed her husband. Now, I wonder if she could have taken possession of that bill. No, I don't think so. It would have been found on her when she was arrested. I believe Marshall must have bribed Jenner to destroy it. More's the pity. I'll never get at him now. The beast." Geoffrey rose to go. "Well," he said, "I've learnt something, but I hardly know if it will be of much assistance to me." "What are you going to do?" Roper asked. Satisfy my conscience. Listen, Mr. Roper. In my father's diary, I found a full account of your visit and the truth about the forgery. I was anxious to know all, therefore I came to you. Now I am satisfied. So far as I am concerned, the matter shall rest where it is. Then you won't help me to crush Marshall? Will nothing deliver him into my hands? He muttered. I'll make a last effort. He must be punished for Elsa's sake. Chapter 19. Job becomes civilized. Again and again did Miss Cass wish that she could tell Jenny Braun the story of the broken link and her position with regard to her father. But she had given her promise and was forced to hold her tongue. On her part, Jenny, always open and honest, felt a trifle embarrassed at the secret understanding with Geoffrey Heron regarding the bill of exchange. It seemed to her too delicate perception to be wrong, for was not the young man her friend's lover? But, like Ruth herself, Jenny had given a promise which could not be broken, and she, too, had to hold her peace. Under these circumstances, both girls were less open with each other than usual, and on this account did not seek one another, as was formerly the case. Jenny made her teaching serve as an excuse, and Ruth took to wandering about the country in the society of her own sad thoughts. She had promised her father to refrain from further meddling with the Jenner case, but she did not think that this bound her to abstain from visiting the Turnpike House, and she was always finding herself in the neighborhood of that ill-omened building. It held the secret of a crime. Several times Ruth had noticed smoke rising from its chimney. She began to think, from the recurrence of this phenomenon, that some tramp had taken up his abode in the deserted building. Full of nervous apprehension lest the said tramp should find something in the house likely to connect her father with the crime, Ruth had, more than once, made up her mind to see who it was that occupied the hovel. But on each occasion her courage failed her at the last moment. But one day she screwed up her courage and set out to visit the Turnpike House. She would, if any other piece of evidence connected with the crime had been discovered, and if so, ascertain who was the finder. As she approached, she could see that although the house still looked dilapidated and disreputable in its green jungle, some attempt had been made to render it fit for human habitation. The windows had been mended, the door repaired, and the roof patched in various places. Ruth walked boldly up the path now, trodden down by the footsteps of the new owner, and after a glance at the closed door, looked in at the window. This was guiltless of blinds or curtain, and she could see quite plainly what was going on inside. To her surprise, the first person she saw was her aunt, Inez, seated by the fire and talking eagerly to Job, who was astride a chair beside her. The gypsy turned his head rapidly as the shadow of the girl, lengthened by the sun, fell across the floor, and he uttered an exclamation of mingled surprise and vexation. Mrs. Marshall, looking up at that moment, beheld her niece, the very last person she expected or, indeed, desired to see in that place. Her dark face grew a trifle pale, her black eyes flashed, and she looked downright savage at the intrusion. However, there was nothing left for it now but to make the best of the situation. So before Ruth had time to recover from her astonishment, Aunt Inez had passed quickly to the window and had thrown it wide open. "Goodness, Ruth, why do you come in that silent way to frighten people? Come in, and don't stand staring there like a fool." Ruth struggled to recover from her surprise. "I am astonished to see you here, Aunt Inez," she said, when she had found her tongue. "I did not know you were acquainted with Job." "He's a pensioner of mine," Mrs. Marshall said, composedly, preparing to shut the window. "Are you coming in, Ruth? We can walk back together. You know I do not approve of your roaming the country in this uncivilized fashion." "It seems I am only following your example," Ruth said pertly. "I am a married woman, and Job's patroness," remarked Ruth, who was too much annoyed by her aunt's manner to be careful. Mrs. Marshall flashed at her a look which boded ill for the harmony of their future relations. "Yes, I am looking after the poor man. There is nothing wrong in that, I hope." "On the contrary," said her niece, and went towards the door. It was opened by Job, who during this interview had been most discreetly silent. He winked at the girl not rudely, but to intimate that he still looked upon her as a Romany sister, and ushered her into the room. Mrs. Marshall had resumed her seat by the fire, and pointed out the other chair to her niece. Job leaned up against the table, and regarded the two with a twinkle in his dark eyes. Evidently, he anticipated some amusement. "Have you been here before, Ruth?" asked the elder lady, sharply. "Once. I was curious to see the place." "On account of the murder, I suppose," replied Mrs. Marshall with contempt. "Really, Ruth, I do wonder that you should care to concern yourself with such horrors." "And why do you come here again?" "To see Job," was the quiet answer. "Me and the lady are pals," put in Job. "Oh, yes. She can patter the black tongue, and she is a real Romany sister." "Perhaps, Ruth, you will explain," said Mrs. Marshall, both puzzled and annoyed. "I think Job has already done so," Ruth said coolly. "I met him here by accident when last I came, and I talked Romany to him. He has taken me as a sister of the gypsy folk. I am a female borrow." "Ruth!" Aunt Inez threw up her hands in horror. "How dare you speak like this? A low gypsy, a tramp, and you a young lady. And pray, where did you learn the gypsy language?" "At school, and out of it. I got a gypsy woman to teach me. But I do not see why you should forbid me to associate with Job, Aunt. You are doing so yourself." "I," exclaimed that lady, with something of defiance in her manner. "But I have taken this poor man under my protection, and I intend to make him comfortable." Ruth did not reply immediately. Then she looked up. "Last time I was here you watched me. Aunt Inez," she said slowly. "Perhaps I did, perhaps I did not," replied that lady coldly. She scorned to tell a lie and refused to own the truth. "Then you know what I found here under the window?" Job looked up eagerly and exchanged a glance with Mrs. Marshall. But that clever lady preserved an imperturbable countenance. "What you found, my dear, is of no consequence to me," she said impatiently and rose to her feet. "It is more to the purpose that we should be going. I will arrange about your weekly money," she said, turning to Job. "Thank you, lady," said the gypsy gratefully. "You're a real good sort. I won't trouble you long, though. I'm booked before the year is out." Ruth lingered, for she wanted to speak to the man alone. But her aunt hurried her away, and the last glimpse she had of him was standing in the doorway laughing in anything but a respectful manner. One would have thought that Miss Cass had burnt her fingers quite severely enough to avoid playing with fire. But such was not the case. Her curiosity was stronger than her prudence. Besides, after the smile she had seen on Job's face, she began to doubt her aunt's plausible explanation. Unfortunately, Mrs. Marshall escorted her niece right up to the gates of Hollyoaks Park, but she refused to go in. "I have left my carriage at the inn," she said, "and, as your uncle is not very well, I must go home at once. I hope you will come and see us soon, Ruth. You are neglecting me very much." "I will come with pleasure, Aunt." "Will next week do?" "Any week will do. I am always at home except on an occasion like this, when I am employed in charitable works. I shall expect you next week." When her aunt had gone, Ruth waited until she was out of sight, then took a short cut across the meadows to the Turnpike House. Within the hour she again presented herself at the door. It was opened so suddenly that she felt sure that Job had been watching her, and his greeting proved that such was the case. "I expected you, sister," he said. "Come into my tent. Duvel, that a Romany should dwell under a roof tree like a Gorgio. It is better for your health than wandering about the roads," said the girl, sitting down. "I am dying," interrupted Job, quietly, "and I am not the man to decay like a tree. If I find that I can never recover, I will die after my own fashion. I am not afraid." Ruth did not know what reply to make to this. She glanced round, hoping to find a fresh topic of conversation. "You are comfortable here. Quite civilized. I am sure that you will get better now that you are so well housed." "I do not think so, lady. But I yielded to Mrs. Marshall's request to take shelter here. One place is as good as another to die in. She is good to me. I have this house and a little money to buy food." "Why is she so kind?" asked Ruth sharply. "Such kindness is not in her nature. Have you done her a good turn?" "Perhaps I have. Maybe I have not," Job said coolly. "See here, sister, I knew you would come back to ask questions. I saw it in your eye, but I know when to keep my mouth shut. You do when it pays you. Well, I have no wish to pry into your secrets, Job. Keep your own counsel." "I intend to," replied the man, "and it is a good thing for your family that I do." "What do you mean?" "Nothing that I can tell you." "Job," Ruth looked at him sharply, "are you hinting at any disgrace?" "No, What disgrace could befall so noble a family? I hold my tongue, because you are paid for it, retorted Ruth. Already her wits were at work trying to search out the reason for all this. She scented a mystery and began vaguely to connect it with the Jenner case. Half in jest, half in earnest, she asked a leading question. Do you know anything of this murder? No. Duvel. I should think not. It was before my time. Yet I wonder you are not afraid to sleep in this room. It was here that the body was found. Job laughed and stared at the stains on the floor near the window. Yes, it was here, he said. But I know nothing. You know what I found last time I came to this place? She said, recalling the glance exchanged between her aunt and the gypsy. Perhaps, replied Job. Then he began to laugh. Oh, you are a rare one, lady, you are, he said. You would rob me of my new tent by asking me to speak about what does not concern you. Ah, then you have something to conceal? Perhaps, said Job again. But you may as well stop, sister. I hold my peace until I die. Ruth looked at him fixedly. By this time she felt quite sure that the secret which procured for Job food and fire and roof tree was connected with the murder. What you know has nothing to do with Mr. Cass, with my father, she asked in a low voice. No, no, on my soul it is not, he said earnestly. Why do you think so, sister? Has it anything to do with the murder? I cannot tell you. You need not, for I can see the truth in your face. Tell me this. Do you know what I found under that window? He looked at her. Yes, I know, he said, softly, and refused to speak another word. Chapter 20. What Mr. Cass had to say. Mr. Cass arrived home in a more cheerful frame of mind. His business, whatever it was, had evidently prospered, and the look of anxiety which his face had worn had given place to his usual imperturbable smile. He was relieved, too, to hear that Amy had gone. Altogether, when the dinner hour arrived, Ruth found that he was as pleased as ever to be alone with her. By the way, my dear, he said after the dessert was placed on the table and they had had some desultory chat, we are about to have a visitor. Geoffrey? Asked Ruth, eagerly. She was longing to see her lover again. No, Neil Webster. I have been to Bognor to see him. He is much better, poor fellow, though still far from well. However, he is coming down here, where he will be surrounded with more comfort than Mrs. Gent can provide. Before long, I hope he will be quite restored to health. I am glad he is coming, Papa. She hesitated, and then continued in a low voice. Are you going to assist him? I thought we had agreed to close that discussion, Ruth, said her father with some coldness. Assist him? What can I do? I have told him that I will endeavor to prove his mother's innocence, but I have not much hope of success. Whatever you may say, Ruth, I believe the woman is guilty. I think she is innocent, cried the girl, throwing back her head with a look of defiance. I know you do. Well, if her innocence can be proved, so much the better. At present, Neil has promised not to worry more than he can help. I want to see him on his feet again. Therefore, he must have cheerful company to distract his mind. Is that why you asked him down here? Asked Ruth, ironically. I am afraid his spirits will not rise in this house. Amy left it because she found the dullness intolerable. Amy is a frivolous butterfly, my dear. I hope you have more sense. You must do your best to amuse Neil, and above all you must say nothing to him about this case. It is becoming a sort of monomania with him, and his thoughts must be kept off it. In that case, I shall get Jenny to amuse him, replied Ruth, for I find it difficult not to become a monomaniac on the subject myself. Besides, I want her to marry him. Mr. Cass stroked his chin and did not appear to look unfavorably on this proposal. Neil might do worse, he said after a pause. Jenny is a good little creature and will make him a very adaptable wife. You would never have suited yourself to the boy. Geoffrey Heron is more in your way, Ruth. He will be at once your husband and your master. So long as he is not a domestic tyrant, I do not care. I am very, very fond of Geoffrey, now that I have got over my foolish feeling for Neil. I do wish Geoffrey would come to see me oftener. At that moment, as if in answer to her words, a servant appeared with a card, which he presented to his master. Queer, exclaimed Mr. Cass, glancing at it through his eyeglass. Here is the very man you want. Geoffrey, she cried joyfully. Yes. I wonder why he did not send me notice of his coming. He wants to see me on business. Business, he repeated with a frown. Humph. I hope he has found no new mare's nest with your assistance. I have meddled no more with the case, Papa, if that is what you mean, said Miss Cass. But where is he? In the library. I will see him first. You can talk to him afterwards. Ask him to stay, Papa, said Ruth, following her father to the door of the dining room. Of course he can stay if he likes, Mr. Cass said, looking at his daughter as if he were about to make some remark. However, he thought better of it and hurried out. Ruth guessed that it had been in his mind to say something about the unhappy affair in which they were all interested. She was irritated at not being admitted into his confidence, for her nerves were worn thin with the constant strain. However, he had been quite determined to see Geoffrey alone, and all she could do was to possess herself in patience until such time as the conversation should have ended. Meanwhile, the two men were sitting opposite one another in Mr. Cass's room. Geoffrey refused to have any dinner. He had dined before leaving home, he said, but he did not decline a cigar and glass of good port. Mr. Cass was at once convinced, from the expression of tragic gravity on the young man's face, that he had something serious to say, and he concluded that it had to do with the Jenner case. But he was not going to commit himself by introducing the subject, lest he might appear too eager. He talked lightly on desultory matters and waited for Heron to begin. Mr. Cass, he said at last, I have come to renew our former conversation. Oh, the Jenner murder, I suppose? Mr. Cass said lightly, I thought as much, but I did not know that you intended to pursue the matter. Nor did I of my own free will, replied Geoffrey, coolly, but circumstances have thrust upon me fresh discoveries, and I want your assistance. Mr. Cass looked up sharply and replied with studied carelessness, Of course I will do my best to help you, my dear fellow, but really I do not see how I can. You will soon see when I have told you of my discovery, was the grim answer. About those links, you know. The merchant started and changed color. Ah, he said, Ruth told you, some time ago, but what she did not tell me, and what you did not reveal, Mr. Cass, was that you were the owner of those links. How can you be certain on that point? Asked Mr. Cass calmly. What have you found out to make you think that they at any rate the broken one Ruth got under the window of the Turnpike House have anything to do with me? I will tell you, he said, leaning forward and looking very directly at his host. You gave a portion of one of those links to your granddaughter Mildred for her doll. I found the child crying because Ruth had taken what she called a brooch from her. At first I did not connect it with the one Ruth had found, but when she described it I guessed that it was part of the set. To make certain, I shewed her the one her aunt had picked up, and she recognized it at once as the double of her brooch, with the difference in the design, of course. You did not tell me of this, Mr. Cass. Why should I have told you? Mr. Cass's tone was slightly defiant. I did give such a link to Mildred, and it was one of a set. Have you the set? Asked Heron. Forgive my asking you, but I have a good reason for doing so. I know what your reason is, replied the merchant, raising his voice. But you are wrong. I did not drop that link at the Turnpike House. I did not murder Jenner. Nothing was further from my mind, protested the young man. You jumped to conclusions. My meaning was quite different. The expression on Mr. Cass's face was one half of relief, half of uneasiness. What do you mean, then? He demanded. I have a right to know. You shall know. It was in order to tell you that I came over this evening. But first, have you the remaining links? Mr. Cass crossed the room to an old-fashioned desk which stood in a corner and began to search. In 5 minutes he returned to his seat by the fire, bringing with him an oval enameled with a pack of cards. That is all I have, he said. Mildred has the one with the horse on it. You have the other with the champagne bottle. And the ballet girl? Where is that one? Mr. Cass was silent and shifted uneasily in his chair. That I cannot tell you until I know more clearly what you have discovered. You shall know all. It may save a certain person from a relentless enemy. Yes, you may look, Mr. Cass. I tell you there is one man who hates another with all the intensity of his soul, and will only too willingly do him an injury. Mr. Cass began to grow angry at this mysterious description. One man, another man, he repeated. What do you mean? Who is the enemy? Julian Roper. And who is he? Heron looked at him in astonishment. If faces were to be read, his host knew nothing of this man. I am surprised that you do not know who Roper is, he said slowly. Why should I? I never even heard his name, that I can recollect. If he has any grudge against me, I cannot understand the reason, seeing, as I have said, that he is unknown to me. I did not say that he had a grudge against you. No, but you hinted as much. After all, I suppose I am the man who is so well hated. At least, I can take your speech in no other way. I don't mean you at all. I allude to Marshall, your brother-in-law. Marshall! Mr. Cass sprang to his feet, and his face turned positively gray. This time Geoffrey had no reason to complain of indifference. It was plain that his host feared the revelation about to be made against his sister's husband. I don't quite understand, he said. What has Marshall? I think you understand very well, Mr. Cass. And I can only wish that during our last conversation you had spoken out. If you want the truth in plain words, I say that Frank Marshall murdered Jenner at the Turnpike House to recover a bill of exchange on which he had forged my father's name. Stop! Stop! Cried Mr. Cass, dropping back into his seat. What grounds have you such an accusation? Is it not true? Upon my word of honor, I cannot say. I think you can, Mr. Cass. You know that Mrs. Jenner is innocent and that Marshall is guilty. The merchant became vehement. I cannot say that, he cried, dashing his fist on the table. Because I don't know. I did suspect Marshall myself on certain grounds, but I knew nothing of this bill. I could not fathom his motive. I was doubtful, and so I came to the conclusion that Mrs. Jenner was the guilty person. I would have told you all this before, Heron, but the honor of my family. I hope to be one of the family myself, soon, Geoffrey said, quietly, and you cannot suppose that I am less anxious than you are to avoid a scandal. I must know the truth now, at all costs. You shall know everything I can tell you. Oh, heavens! If it should be so, if he should be guilty, I could never be sure, never, or I would have taken steps to get that unfortunate woman released. I did not want her to suffer. In some way, without incriminating Marshall, I would have managed it, if only I had been sure. But this bill, that was his motive, and I never knew. He did not tell me that. As to Roper, I can assure you that this is the first time, to my knowledge, that I have heard his name, yet he discounted the bill. It was in his office that Jenner was employed after he had failed on the stage. I took no interest in the man after I had dismissed him. I never even heard his employer's name. He stole the bill, I suppose. Yes, I begin to understand, and he came down here to blackmail Marshall. Quite so. Great heavens! Can he be guilty, after all? I'll have the truth out of him at all costs. That is the difficult part of it, Geoffrey said with a flush. I can make Marshall speak out, but I dread his confession. By rights, we should give him up to the law, and yet the disgrace, We must get at the truth first. Afterwards we can decide how to get the woman released, and how to punish my wretched brother-in-law. Tell me what proof you have against him. Heron produced his pocketbook, and took therefrom the bill of exchange, which he gave to Mr. Cass. He started, as though a snake had stung him. Forged? He asked, placing his finger on the signature of Geoffrey Heron. Then, on a nod from that young man, he added, Did you find this among your father's papers? No, that is impossible. Jenner must have had it on the night he was murdered. Yet if Marshall killed him to get possession of it, how came it into your hands? Because Marshall lost the fruits of his wickedness, he never gained possession of this bill. Jenner was too clever for him. It seems, as I learned from Mrs. Jenner, that she left him alone while she put her child to bed. During that time he, fearing, no doubt, lest Marshall should try and recover it, sewed it up in the body of a toy horse with which his boy had been playing. Neil sent the horse to George Chisel, your grandson, and he, as children will, cut up the animal. Miss Braun saw this paper among the stuffing and gave it to me. Does she know? Has she said? She knows nothing of the connection of this with the murder, and she has said nothing, for I made her give me her word that she would not. No one but you and I and she are aware of its existence. Roper, what of Roper? He knows nothing about it. If you knew how he hated Marshall, you would be glad that he is ignorant, for he would certainly prosecute if he got hold of this paper. I doubt if he could now, seeing that your father, who alone could give evidence as to the falsity of the signature, is dead. But why does he hate Marshall so bitterly? Well, it appears that Roper had a daughter who fell in love with him. She would have married him, and he had given her every reason to believe that he would. But, of course, he stopped at that, and she died of a broken heart. I don't think there was anything scandalous about the affair, nothing worse than the playing fast and loose with the affections of the unhappy girl. He always was a scoundrel. I paid him a large sum to leave my firm, as I feared he would do something criminal some day. Then he married my sister. I begged her to give him up, but she was headstrong and insisted. "Great heavens!" he cried. And he married her very shortly after he had committed this crime. Yet I doubt very much if he would have had the courage to kill Jenner. Will you tell me what led you to suspect him? In the first place, from the circumstances of his return on that night. In the second, these links. How is that? I should like to know all from the beginning. Well, Marshall was staying here on the night of the crime. He looked out of sorts, but he made some excuse, I forget what. After dinner, he said he was going out for a walk. It was wet and misty, and I tried to dissuade him. My sister had gone to bed with a headache. I was alone, and although I never liked him, I wanted to talk to him. But he insisted upon going. About 9 he returned, knocked at the library window, that French window over there, and I let him in, torn and muddy and wild with fear. He said that he had been set upon by robbers' footpads. The next morning I heard of the murder, and I spoke to him about it. But he swore that he had not seen Jenner. Tell me about the links. Are they yours? Yes. I bought them many years ago, when I was young and vain. Marshall saw them, and took a great fancy to them. So I gave him the set, and now, Mr. Cass clenched his hands. I fear, if he got his deserts, that they would hang him. And, quite overcome, he bowed his head on the table. Chapter 21. Ruth is comforted. Presently Mr. Cass raised his head and looked at Geoffrey with such a woebegone expression that the young man started. It seemed as if the merchant had grown suddenly old. Lines appeared on his face which had never been there before. His eyes were sunken, and his shoulders had bowed themselves as though the whole weight of his misery had been placed upon them. The transformation was at once startling and painful. "Don't take it so much to heart," said Heron. "After all, we may both be wrong about Marshall." "I hope so. I trust so," was the hoarse reply. "But if he is guilty, what am I to think of myself? I had a suspicion, on the grounds of which I have told you. Yet here I have allowed an innocent woman to spend all these years in jail, when that scoundrel should have been in her place. As to that, you could hardly have accused your sister's husband. He was not married to her at the time. If I had insisted upon an explanation that night when he came in torn and dirty at yonder window, I might have prevented the marriage. I do not think that even the mad love that Inez had for him would have stood such a test. But Mrs. Jenner held her tongue when she should have spoken out, so I had no clue. Even if she had spoken out, she could have done nothing. She was silent because she fancied that Neil, in his madness, had killed his father. She never suspected Marshall. But retrospection can do no good. The thing is done, and what we have to consider now is how best to get out of it. If Marshall is guilty, he must give us a written confession and leave the country without our connivance. What purpose would it serve to have him suffer at this stage? Besides, from all I have heard from Mrs. Jenner, her scamp of a husband quite deserved his fate. Marshall's confession would set her free. At the cost of publicity, burst out Mr. Cass. How disgrace, Heron? Think of my sister, of Ruth, of Amy, my married daughter. It would mean ruin to them all. And you, how could you marry into such a family? Oh, as to that, I am not afraid to face the world. I should be a mean hound if I were to visit Marshall's sins on Ruth. Whatever happens, you may be certain that Ruth will be my wife, and that she will receive from me all the love and affection due to so charming and honest a girl. Thank you, Heron. He grasped the young man's hand. But, exclaimed the younger man, as to Marshall, when we know the truth for certain, we will decide how to act. Above all, we must not be in a hurry. You say you gave the links to him? I did. And, what is more, he wore them on that night. I remember his calling my attention to them at dinner. Humph! Then he alone could have lost that one at the Turnpike House. I suppose you did not notice if one was missing from his cuff when he came into this room? No, I never gave the matter a thought. There was no reason why I should. I believed that he had been attacked by gypsies. You know how many there are always about these lonely roads. An assault of that nature would have been quite enough to account for the mud on his clothes and their torn condition. I never thought he had met Jenner. Was there bad blood between them? Well, I am not quite sure. It seems that Marshall had persecuted Mrs. Jenner with his attentions, but her husband was not of the sort to take any trouble about that. He and Marshall, I have been boon companions for a long time. Whether they parted on account of Cum Row, I don't know, but one thing is clear, that Jenner saw Marshall again when Marshall called on Julian Roper to discount that bill, and finding that it was a forgery stole it to come down here and blackmail his former friend. How could he find out that it was a forgery? Oh, very easily. Roper might have talked, or Jenner might have listened. At all events, he knew the truth. I suppose they met that night at the Turnpike House. No, said Heron, suddenly recollecting his conversation with the dead man's widow. Jenner had seen Marshall before he came to the Turnpike House. Of course, Marshall might have followed him and watched him through the window. Then seeing the pocketbook which he supposed would contain the bill, he might have killed him and cleared off. But this Marshall must tell us. That's if he can be made to tell. I'll force it out of him, Mr. Cass said grimly. Those sleeve links, for instance. He has to explain how he came to lose one at the Turnpike House. I remember after Marshall went away from here, the housemaid brought me the pair, enameled the pack of cards, and the horse, which he said Mr. Marshall had left in his room. I thought he must be tired of them, and that he had probably taken the other pair with him by mistake. So I put those he had left into my desk, and I thought no more about it. When Mildred wanted a brooch for her doll, I separated them and gave one to the child, the one with the horse. The one with the pack of cards I left on my table, intending to give it to Ethel. I have the champagne bottle link which was dropped under the window, Geoffrey said. Now, what has become of the other one, the ballet girl? No doubt that also will be found at the Turnpike House, said Mr. Cass. I must tell you that the fastening of the links was somewhat worn, and that a slight tug would have broken them. In putting his arm through the window to grasp the knife, which Mrs. Jenner says was on the table, I dare say Marshall's cuff caught in a nail, and the links were torn apart. Both would have fallen to the ground. One has been found, the other, no doubt, is still on the ground. In that case, we must make a search tomorrow, said Geoffrey, rising. No, we must see Marshall first, Mr. Cass said, very decidedly. I would go over with you tonight, but that would make Inez suspicious. I do not want her to know anything of all this. And, after all, we may be mistaken, but he must give us an explanation. I will write a note to him this evening and ask him to come over tomorrow. You call here, Heron, at 11 o'clock, and we will force the truth out of him. Very well, I think that would be best. I hope he will be able to exculpate himself. If Mrs. Marshall should get to know, she would fight for her husband tooth and nail. You don't know what a tigress my sister is when she is roused. The Spanish blood, I suppose. By the way, he went on, looking at Heron with a faint smile, I am half Spanish, too, and no doubt I am credited with a fiery temper, confess. Now, Heron, you thought from my silence that I had killed this man? Geoffrey nodded with some embarrassment. I did, he said frankly. But can you blame me? Appearances were against you. Mr. Cass shrugged his shoulders. No, I don't blame you, he said. But you might have given me the benefit of the doubt. Appearances are against Marshall, too. Well, we shall see if he is as wrongly suspected as I was. Are you going now? It is early. I should like to see Ruth for a few minutes. Well, she will be quite as glad to see you. She is dull, poor girl, and the horror of this thing, so much as she knows of it at least, has got on her nerves. Go and see her, and come here at 11 tomorrow. Of course, you will tell her nothing. Certainly not. Good night. By the way, I forgot to tell you that Webster is coming down next week. He is much better, and I think the change will do him good. Humph! Will you tell him of this discovery? I don't know. What do you think? I should say nothing until we are quite certain. Let us our own counsel for the honor of the family. I think you are right, said Mr. Cass with a sigh. Heaven grant, for the happiness of us all, that we are wrong in our suspicions. Now go, my dear Hoy, and leave me to think the matter over. Ruth is waiting for you. Heron found Ruth in the winter garden and in tears. She told him she was the most miserable girl in the world, and that nobody cared for her, which last statement Mr. Heron was not inclined to hear without venturing to put forward his own claims. My darling girl, how can you say so? He asked, pressing her closely in his arms. I love you more than all the world. Every man says that when he can think of nothing else to say, replied Ruth, who was too much disturbed to be wholly just. And if you really loved me, you wouldn't have neglected me so. My dear, I was busy. You know what took up my time? Yes, I know, and I wish I didn't know. This horrid business has troubled me morn and night. I wonder my hair hasn't turned gray. Nonsense, cried Geoffrey. It is as black as ever. Black as the outlook of our lives. Heron could not help a smile at this grandiloquent speech. It was so unlike Ruth to indulge in what the Americans call tall talk. Leave the wretched affair alone, dear, he said, kissing her. You need not trouble your pretty head any more about it. But I must, she insisted. If my suspicions are not set at rest, I shall go mad. And the worst of it is, I have promised my father to tell you nothing. If I could only speak freely to you, it would ease my mind. Then ease it and speak freely, Ruth. Oh, you need not shake your head. I know what you're talking about, those sleeve links. Yes, that is it, she cried hysterically. I have nearly killed myself with anxiety over the whole thing. Oh, what a wicked girl I am. No, my dear, only a very foolish girl. But you can set your mind at rest once and for all. Your father is perfectly innocent of what you impute to him. He had nothing to do with the crime, and he believed in all good faith that Mrs. Jenner was the guilty person. Ruth rose to her feet, and a smile of relief dispelled her tears. Oh, how delighted I am, she said excitedly. I shan't worry any more. Oh, how thankful I am. What a weight is off my mind. But why didn't he tell me before? He had his reasons which he has explained to me. Then he not trouble you, my dear. I think you had better put the whole affair out of your mind. I will, now that Papa is free from the stigma. He does not know that I thought he was seriously mixed up in the case. He would never forgive me if he did. Don't ever tell him, Geoffrey. No, I won't. Now, don't worry any more. But, Geoffrey, if Mrs. Jenner is not guilty, who is? Ah, we must find that out, replied Heron, thinking it best not to reveal anything about Mr. Marshall in explanation, which would only have caused fresh trouble. If you are wise, Ruth, you will leave the matter alone. I intend to, she said. But there is one thing I want to tell you, Geoffrey Job Lovell. Who is he? The gypsy. Didn't I tell you about him? Yes. I think you did say something about having met him at the Turnpike House. Well, what has he been doing? Nothing, except that he has taken up his abode at the Turnpike House. Like his impudence, cried the young man. Why, that house is mine, and if he wanted to live in the wretched hovel, he should have come to me. Besides, I do not wish anyone to live in that shamble. I intend to have it pulled down, and so get rid of all the legends which haunt the neighborhood. I wish you would pull it down. It is an ill-omened place, a blot on the landscape, and the sooner it is removed, the better it will be for the countryside. The people round here think it is haunted, you know, and that keeps up the memory of the murder. If the house were pulled down, there would be an end of it all, and the sooner the better. But I do not know what Aunt Inez will say. Mrs. Marshall? Cried Geoffrey, looking at her sharply. What has she got to do with it? That is what I want to tell you. It seems that Aunt Inez has taken an interest in Job. She suggested that he should patch up the house and live in it, and she has arranged to allow him so much a week to live on. Humph! That is strange. Mrs. Marshall is not usually so philanthropic. That's exactly what I thought, and that made me think that Papa had something to do with the murder, and that Aunt Inez was shielding him. Shielding him how? By assisting Job. I went to see him the other day, and I found Aunt Inez there. She was very angry with me for having gone. I saw Job afterwards, and he would tell me nothing, but he hinted at a secret between him and Aunt Inez. Now I think. Don't think anything about it, Heron said, with a forced laugh. Your aunt is getting charitable in her old age. Believe me, there is nothing between her and the gypsy, relative to the murder, whatever he may say. But he talked Geoffrey, I dare say. I wonder he did not threaten. I will this for myself, and if he knows anything which I very much doubt, I will get it out of him. My dear, how can you think your aunt knows anything about the matter? Now, Ruth, you must promise me to leave it all alone and think no more about it. Very well, she said, with unusual meekness. Then you don't think Aunt Inez has anything to do any knowledge, I mean? I am quite sure she is not. She is kind to Job out of pure charity. Now I must say good night, and once more, don't worry. But as he drove home, he came to the conclusion that Mrs. Marshall's kindness to the gypsy was meant, in some way, to shield her husband. And that complicates matters, thought Heron. Chapter 22. At bay. On the following morning, Geoffrey arrived precisely at the time appointed by Mr. Cass, and was shown at once into the library. His host was there alone, for Marshall, with his usual want of punctuality, had not yet appeared. Geoffrey was informed of the sudden change in Ruth. "Your visit did her good last night," said her father with a smile. "I told her not to worry herself, that all was quite right, and she seemed comforted. But she told me something which seems to hint that Mrs. Marshall knows of her husband's guilt." And he repeated Ruth's tale about the gypsy and Mrs. Marshall's kindness to him, her extraordinary kindness, he termed it. Mr. Cass listened attentively, but shook his head. "I don't agree with you," he said. "You do not know Inez as I do." While they were still speaking in whispers like two guilty people, Marshall bustled into the room in what he would have called his breezy fashion. In reality, his manner was simply aggressive and noisy, but it gave him the air of being what he wanted to be thought, a creature too guileless and unconventional to conceal his feelings. "Good day, Cass," he cried loudly to his former partner, and nodding to Heron. "Well, here I am. What's the matter? Got into any trouble?" "No, I have not got into any trouble," was Mr. Cass's emphatic reply. "This boy, then?" And Marshall turned smilingly to Geoffrey, upon whom he looked as a possible member of the family. "You're in trouble, eh? Ah, well, young men will be young men." "I am sure you speak from experience, Marshall," said Mr. Cass, while Heron contented himself with a shake of the head. "But there is nothing wrong with Heron." "Very glad, I'm sure," Marshall said insolently. It seemed as though he scented some trouble in the air and thought to meet it with bluff. As yet he had not the faintest idea that the coming conversation was to be serious for him personally. "Well," he went on, "as you are all right and Heron is a good boy, why have you asked me to come over?" "Can't you guess?" asked Geoffrey, angered by the man's manner. He lifted his eyebrows. "No," he said tranquilly. "I really am at a loss to understand why." "Cast your thoughts back 12 years, interrupted Mr. Cass, sharply, "and then perhaps you will understand why." "What do you mean?" asked his brother-in-law, a thrill running through him. He saw now that this was going to be serious for him. "Do you remember the night when you came in at yonder window, muddy and ragged?" Mr. Cass said slowly. "When you told me a lie that you had been attacked by footpads and—" "It was no lie," cried the man, moistening his dry lips. "I told you what had actually happened." "Oh, no, you didn't. For instance, you never told me that you had seen Jenner." He uttered a faint cry and flung himself back in his chair with a startled look. "I did not see Jenner," he said. "Nor did you tell me that you had been at the Turnpike House," continued Mr. Cass, not noticing the interruption. "That I deny. I was not near the Turnpike House." With a look of scorn, Mr. Cass picked up an object which was lying on the table and held it out. "Do you know what this is?" "A piece of gold, so far as I can see." "What is that to me?" "Evidence that you were at the Turnpike House on that night." "I tell you I was not there," he cried desperately. "Oh, don't trouble yourself to tell lies," Mr. Cass said wearily. "They will avail you nothing in the end. Since you do not choose to recognize this object, let me tell you that it is a part of the set of links I gave you shortly before that murder. Links, I only wore them once. I know you did, and on that night, you lost one pair and left the other in your bedroom, where they were found by the housemaid and returned to me. You would have been better advised had you destroyed them, Marshall." "Why should I have destroyed them?" "I lost one pair, it is true. The catch between the ovals was worn, and the links broke." "Not of their own accord," Mr. Cass said quickly. "Your cuff caught on a nail when you put your arm through the window to kill Jenner." Marshall uttered a loud cry and started to his feet, his face crimson with rage and shaking with what looked very much like terror. "I deny that," he cried. "I deny that I was at the Turnpike House, that I killed." "This link was found under the window," interrupted Mr. Cass. "The man who wore it was the man who killed Jenner." "You are the man." "I killed Jenner? It is a lie." Marshall continued to stare at the piece of gold which his brother-in-law continued to hold up as though he were fascinated. He drew his hand across his brow as he uttered his denial in a weak voice, and seemed to be trying to recall something. "Why should I have killed him?" he asked. It was now Heron's turn. He drew from his pocket the bill of exchange. "Perhaps this will supply the motive," he said coldly. "This forgery, discounted by Julian Roper." With a face now positively purple and eyes almost staring out of his head, Marshall craned forward his head to look at the fatal evidence of his past. He recognized it only too well. For years he had been dreading this moment, and now that it had arrived, the sight of the document proved too much for him. With a strangled cry, he tugged at his collar, then fell like a log on the floor. The strong man, the guilty man, had fainted, and neither Mr. Cass nor Heron were moved by the catastrophe. It was to them decisive evidence of his guilt. And when they recalled the lifelong imprisonment of Mrs. Jenner, they could find no pity in their hearts for the detected rogue. Rather were they full of pity for those unhappy people with whom he was connected by marriage. Nothing in their eyes could expiate his guilt. "It would be better if he died now," said Mr. Cass, as he watched Heron loosen his collar and dash cold water on his face. "Pardon me, not at all," replied the younger man, looking up for a moment. If he died now, there would be no confession. In the end, they brought him round and placed him again in his chair, a pitiable object, with his damp hair, his loosened collar, and the imploring look in his eyes. The most meritorious of men could not have looked dignified under such circumstances, much less Frank Marshall, who was, so to speak, in the dock before two prejudiced judges. "I suppose you are going to give me up," he said. "On the contrary, we want to get you out of this trouble for the sake of the family," said Mr. Cass coldly. "Though by rights you should hang." "They don't hang for forgery," stammered the wretched creature, arranging his collar. "Pshaw! I am not speaking of the minor crime, but of the greater. It was you who murdered Jenner." "I did not. I swear I did not." "You did. I am convinced of it. He came down here with that bill in order to blackmail you, and you killed him. He made no attempt to assert his dignity." "You can kick a man when he is down if you like," he said in a quavering voice, "even though he is your sister's husband, but you have no right to accuse him of a crime he did not commit. I tell you I forged that bill, but I did not kill the man. You knew that he was in the neighborhood?" "No. I was as much astonished as you could have been when I heard of his death." "If you are innocent," it was Heron who spoke, "how did it happen that a part of the links you were wearing were found under the window of the house? You must have dropped it there." "I did not." He seemed to be reflecting. "If you want to know the truth, that pair of links was torn from me by the footpads who attacked me. I dare say they killed him." "Rubbish," cried Mr. Cass, looking at him with disgust. "Why do you tell such lies? You met Jenner on that night, although you denied it when I questioned you." "I was afraid of being implicated in a murder. I knew if you had the slightest suspicion of me, you would have stopped my marriage with Inez, and I loved her." "You love her money, you mean?" "Well, then, I love her money," Marshall cried violently. "I was on the brink of ruin, and it was only her that stood between me and the streets. I had to pay Roper the £500. He could not have prosecuted as the bill was missing, but he could have talked, and he would have talked had I not paid him the full sum. It was only when I had possession of the money, my wife's money, that I was able to shut his mouth. I knew before then that the bill was lost." "Because Jenner had shown it to you on that night?" Marshall turned away sullenly, but still under compulsion answered, "Yes, he did. I had received a letter from him saying that he was coming here with the bill and would sell it to me. He asked me to meet him at the Wagoner's Pond, half a mile from the Turnpike House, where his wife was staying. As I had no money, and was in his power absolutely, for by shewing the bill to you, Cass, he could have had my marriage with your sister broken off, I was forced to meet him, and I did meet him at 7 o'clock. "Oh, so you did go out that night to meet him?" "I did," he said defiantly. "I dare not tell you, for you have always had so many absurd prejudices. So I told you I was going for a walk, and stole out to meet Jenner at the Wagoner's Pond. I said that if he would wait till I was married and could handle money, I would buy the bill. So, finding that unless I made your sister my wife, I should never have a penny, he consented." "Oh," said Mr. Cass, "he consented to go without his pound of flesh, a man like Jenner, bloodsucker and thief. He had to choose between exposing me and getting nothing, or waiting and being paid," said Marshall vehemently. "Besides, he knew that Roper was after him because he had stolen the bill, and that if he made a fuss, whatever row I might get into, he would be in trouble himself. So he agreed to wait until I had married Inez and then to accept £1,000. Meanwhile, he kept the bill and promised to hold his tongue about it. He said he was going on to see his wife at the Turnpike House and that he would get money from her which would enable him to lie low for a time while Roper was searching for him. It was arranged that when I was married and had paid him the £1,000 he should go to America. I agreed to all this. I could do nothing else, and then we parted. Is that the truth? Heron asked skeptically. Yes, it is. You can believe or disbelieve it as you like. I left him by the Wagoner's Pond, and that was the last I saw of him alive or dead. On my way back to the house, I was attacked by some tramps who took my watch. They wrenched my links off, that is one pair. The missing pair and were about to take the other when they heard someone coming and made off. I returned here and told Cass as little as I could, in case he might see fit to stop my marriage with his sister. I wish to heaven I had stopped it, Mr. Cass said, fiercely. I don't believe a word you say. Chapter 23. Still in doubt. Marshall, seeing that the two men were silent, began to recover his self-command. I see you don't believe me. Perhaps there is no reason why you should, but I swear I do not know who killed Jenner. If I had known, I should have got that bill out of him. Oh, said Geoffrey, and you would have condoned his sin so long as he gave you back the evidence of your own. I would. Every man for himself in this world. I would have told him, whosoever he was, that if he did not give me back the bill, I would denounce him to the police. But I have not the least idea who the guilty person is. He wiped his face. In all these years I have lived in misery, fearing daily and hourly that the bill would turn up. I knew Roper would not spare me if he got possession of it. No wonder, remarked Heron, seeing how badly you treated his daughter Elsa. The culprit had the grace to blush. Elsa Roper was never a penny the worse by me, he said. When I used to go to her father's office to procure money, she chose to fall in love with me. I made capital out of that, as I do out of most things. Don't be so shameless, man, interposed his brother-in-law, sharply. Marshall sickened him with his fluent villainy. Oh, you were always a Puritan, sneered Marshall. However, that is neither here nor there. I let the girl believe that I cared for her in order to get her father to part with his money, but I never intended to marry her. And she died of a broken heart, put in Heron. So the old man says, as though a woman ever died of such a thing. She caught a chill and was carried off because she was not sufficiently well nourished. That is the truth, although old Roper prefers to put it down to me. If he had fed her better, she would be alive now. But he'd choose her to think I killed her and would do me a serious injury if he could. I am glad the bill did not fall into his hands. Where did you get it? He asked, turning to Geoffrey. Or if you can tell me the name of the person who had it, I can tell you who was the assassin of Jenner. Oh, it is quite true. Jenner shewed me the bill that night by the Wagoner's Pond. I would have taken it by force, but he was stronger than I. There was no chance of my getting the better of him. But I noticed that he took it out of a red pocketbook. Now, that pocketbook was never produced at the trial, so the assassin must have it. Then you don't think Mrs. Jenner killed him? She wouldn't have killed a fly. No, she did not kill him. If she had, that red pocketbook would have been produced in court. I have been living in fear ever since, wondering who had it, though I always intended to make use of the murder should the assassin have tried to blackmail me. Who did you get the bill from, Heron? I did not get it from anyone. Jenner evidently thought that you might come after him to steal it. So, according to his wife, he sewed it up in the body of a toy horse with which his child had been playing. Lately, Neil wished to give this toy to George Chisel, so it came into Ruth's possession. The boy cut it open, and Miss Braun found the bill. She gave it to me, and I at once saw Roper about it. Besides, I read up my father's diary and found that his name had been forged. Did he know that I had done it? Yes. Roper called on him to tell him so. If my father had not died, Mr. Marshall, you would have found yourself in prison for forgery. No, I should not. You forget that Jenner stole the bill. No one could have prosecuted me without producing the document. I know enough law for that. Besides, I had paid the money to Roper, and that I did only to avoid a scandal. Does Ruth know about this? Or Miss Braun? Or George? They know nothing, replied Mr. Cass. Ruth does not even know of the existence of this bill. George is but a child and took no notice of it. As for Miss Braun, she thinks the signature is all right. She will hold her tongue. Oh, you are quite safe so far. But this murder, I feel certain that you committed it. No one else could have had so powerful a motive. Still, someone else might have had a motive for all that. I am sure Mrs. Jenner is innocent. But her husband had lots of enemies, and many would gladly have done it, could they have escaped the consequences. The only thing that puzzles me is the disappearance of the red pocketbook. I understand all about the bill now. It cannot have been made use of. Well, the whole affair is a mystery, but all I can say is that I did not kill the man. I knew if it came to the pinch, I could always prove that. It has come to the pinch now, said Mr. Cass, sternly. Prove your innocence. If you can, for my part, one believe you are guilty. More fool you, was the retort. On that night, if you remember, we had dinner at 6 light dinner, dished up in a hurry. Your wife had to go to London. You told her you would have some supper at 9. Did you not? Yes, I remember something of that, said Mr. Cass after a pause. Was I not into supper? Yes, you were. I remember that too. And supper was at 9? Yes, it was ordered for 9. And I postponed it till past because I did not feel hungry. I was here when you gave the order, because you asked me whether I would prefer supper at once or wait. That is true enough. Well, if you will look again into the evidence given at the trial of that unfortunate woman, you will find that the doctor said that Jenner had been killed at 9 o'clock. Therefore, it could not have been I who struck the blow. By your own shewing, I was with you at the time. Now, am I innocent or guilty? Mr. Cass looked at Geoffrey. All this is true enough, he said quietly. I begin to believe that you did not do it after all. If you can be so honest as to admit that I was in this room at 9 o'clock, I could not have killed Jenner, who was at that very time being murdered by some unknown person for miles away. I am a forger, I admit that. But, here he became finely scornful, I am not a murderer. Foolish I may have been, wicked I never was. The two listeners gazed at each other in amazement. Then Marshall went on. Now I know where the bill is. I feel relieved, he said, and his self-pity was almost pathetic. I can sleep in peace, more especially when it has been destroyed. As he spoke, he advanced his hand towards the table with the intention of taking the paper. Mr. Cass anticipated him and snatched the incriminating document away. No, Marshall, he said, putting it in his pocket. I keep this. You are too dangerous a man to be allowed to go your own way. I use this bill as a whip to manage you. Behave yourself, and act a decent part for the remainder of your life, and no one shall ever know of this. But try any of your tricks, and you will be laid by the heels. Do you call this honorable? Blustered Marshall. I call it caution. You are quite safe with me, and I am sure our friend Heron will say nothing. Certainly, I shall be guided entirely by Mr. Cass. But Roper might get hold of it, and then I should be lost. Roper will not get hold of it. I keep it, Marshall. It is for your wife's sake only that I am thus lenient. So far as you are concerned, nothing would give me greater pleasure than to see you suffering a just punishment. You are the most unblushing scoundrel I have ever seen. You had better look out, Cass, said Marshall, threateningly. I can make you pay dearly for these insults. Can any person possibly insult you? Sneered Mr. Cass. Do what you like, but remember, he touched his breast pocket, I will exact payment. Now you know. As for the rest, I don't want you in my house again, but as that might provoke remark on the part of Inez and lead to an explanation, I will permit you to call occasionally, but I hope your visits will be rare. Were I in your place, I should go abroad. Now you can go. The man was livid with rage. He was evidently inclined to make trouble. He knew that he could go pretty far, for only the direst extremity would force Mr. Cass into creating a scandal by producing the bill. But he could find nothing to say in face of the threat held over him, and, cowed by the looks of the two men, he finally sneaked out of the room. Then he left the house. But he had recovered himself sufficiently to make a gay remark to Ruth and Jenny, whom he met returning from their walk. Truly the man was bad to the core. Do you believe him? Asked Heron when they were alone. Yes, what he says is perfectly correct. I confess I am greatly relieved. So am I. But do you think he knows who killed Jenner? He might, but that we shall never get out of him. On the other hand, I am inclined to think he does not know, for believing the assassin to have had the bill, he would have made an attempt to get it from him. But what is to be done next? Mrs. Jenner is still in jail and ill. Ah, that reminds me, said Geoffrey, taking a letter out of his pocket. I had this from Neil this morning. I intended to show it to you, But our interview with our friend put it out of my head. He is coming down today." "What?" exclaimed Mr. Cass, running his eyes over the letter. "Is he well enough to travel?" "Oh, yes. He has wonderful recuperative power. You see, he says there that he intends to see his mother. It appears she has sent for him. He must have gone to her yesterday, as he is coming down today. I am anxious to see him, for I cannot help wondering why she should have sent for him. Do you think she might have something to tell him?" "No." Mr. Cass shook his head. "I saw her the other day. She is quite ignorant who killed her husband. She is in the infirmary now, and very ill. I don't think the end is far off. I expect she sent for Neil to bid him goodbye." Mr. Cass paused for a moment. "You know, Heron," he said, "in spite of all the trails you have followed, I cannot help thinking that she really killed her husband. I cannot believe it. The person who committed the murder was the man who got those links who dropped one under the window. Then we shall never find out. Marshall might know. He might have recognized the footpads who attacked him that night," suggested Heron. Then he started, struck with a sudden idea. "By the way, is it possible that the gypsy job was one of them? That would explain how he comes to be so intimate with your sister." "I don't see that," remarked Mr. Cass with a frown. "If she knew that Job had attacked her husband and had afterwards murdered Jenner, he would receive but short shrift from the hands of Inez. She is no sentimentalist." "But, don't you see," persisted Geoffrey, "she may think that he has the bill. She may be keeping her knowledge of the murder quiet so that Job may not produce the document and incriminate her husband. Inez knows nothing about the bill. You heard what her husband said. He is such a liar," cried Heron in disgust. "Nevertheless, I believe on this occasion he spoke the truth. I cannot believe that my sister, in spite of her love for that reptile, would go as far as to grovel to a gypsy and shield a murderer. No, the gypsy might have been one of those who attacked Marshall on that night, but I do not believe that he killed Jenner. Don't trouble any more about the matter, Heron. We have done all we could with no result. Besides, Mrs. Jenner, poor soul, will soon be released from her unjust imprisonment if, indeed, it be unjust. Death will set her free. What about Neil and his wish to see his mother cleared?" "We shall see what he says about that," replied Mr. Cass, closing the subject in a more peremptory manner than was usual with him. The same afternoon, Neil Webster arrived at Hollyoaks, looking a shadow of his former self, pale and fragile and very downcast. Ruth and Jenny both gave him a cordial welcome, and neither his host nor Geoffrey Heron were lacking in heartiness. But all the kindness and attention he received served only to make the young man more melancholy. Observing this, and knowing that he had seen his mother, Mr. Cass took the first opportunity to draw him into the library. It might be that Mrs. Jenner had told the poor fellow something. It appeared that she had. "Yes, I saw her," Neil said in reply to Mr. Cass's question. "She is dying. I have seen her for the last time. She cannot live many days now. Indeed, I wanted to stay beside her till the end, but she would not hear of it. She said that I was to go away and remember always that she had loved me. For the rest, I was to put her out of my mind and live as good a life as I could. Then she kissed me, and we parted. Is that all?" "That is all, except that she has commanded me to stop searching for the real assassin of my father." "Did she say that?" "Yes. She said no one would ever find out the truth, and moreover, that my father had deserved his fate. She was sure I had not committed the crime. She swore that she herself was guiltless, but she said that it was quite impossible that the truth should ever come to light." "Do you think she knows the truth, Neil?" "No, I am sure she does not. She said if she did, she would have told me, if only to put my mind at rest. But she knows nothing. Poor mother! And what do you intend to do?" "Obey her commands," said Neil. "I shall search no more." Chapter 24. Another piece of evidence. Ruth let Miss Braun take entire possession of Neil. In spite of his languid ways, Webster was an interesting study to a woman. So Miss Cass found it a trifle dull, for Geoffrey had returned to his own place, and did not come over to Hollyoaks quite so often as she thought he might have done. Yet she rarely intruded upon Jenny and Neil, but allowed them to drift into a companionship which she devoutly hoped would result in the closer tie of marriage. Jenny continued to give the usual lessons to her little pupils, and after school hours Ruth took them off her hands, so that she might be free to entertain Neil. After a time, he recovered sufficient interest in his music to take up his violin, and with Jenny he spent long hours going over his old music and experimenting on new. Meanwhile, Ruth naturally found the house extremely dull without Geoffrey, so she spent as much time as possible in long walks, in riding her bicycle, and in paying visits. One day, she recollected her promise to call and see her Aunt Inez. Mr. Marshall had gone for a change to Brighton, where, no doubt, he was enjoying himself after his usual selfish fashion. His wife had declined to accompany him, giving as her reason that she had more to do than waste her time among a pack of fools, as she was wont to designate the rest of the world. So she remained at home and attended to her duties in rather a joyless way. She still retained a mild love for her husband. She despised his weaknesses. She hated his lack of principle. But some sentiment of love remained at the bottom of her soul. Companionship had begotten toleration, and on the whole, she thought she was not worse off than other women. She, at least, could govern her husband's weaker nature and could curb his follies. And this somewhat unsatisfactory employment gave her plenty to do. So she succeeded in passing her life in an endurable fashion. Fortunately for her, she was not a woman who had the capacity for being bored. 9 out of 10 women would have killed themselves out of sheer weariness of the flesh. But Mrs. Marshall continued to live on grimly. Ruth had often wondered in her secret soul if her aunt were doing penance for some hidden sin. It was the only way in which she could account for the asceticism of her life. She lived in an ugly house, in which all the rooms were hideous both in color and design, all, save those which were occupied by the master of the house. His apartments, furnished by himself, were charming in every way. As she stood now in the stone-hued drawing-room, the melancholy of the place struck Ruth more than ever, and moreover, glancing round the room, she caught sight of a copy of Thomas à Kempis. "She's taking to religion," she thought, turning over the leaves. "I really wonder if there is a secret in her past life to account for." But at this moment a grim maid-servant entered to interrupt her conjectures. "If you please, miss," she said, "mistress is in the garret storing things, and she wants to know if you will go up to her there." "Oh, certainly," said Ruth, wondering if her aunt were mad that she should invite a visitor to go poking about among old lumber even though that visitor were her niece. But she meekly followed the maid up to the top of the house and was introduced into a long, low, wide attic immediately under the roof. Here Aunt Inez, in a stone-colored dress, with a severe face, gave her an icy greeting. In spite of the summer warmth, the garret was chilly, and this, joined to her reception, made the girl shiver. "I am glad you have remembered me at last, Ruth," said Mrs. Marshall, in her most metallic tones. "I was beginning to think you had forgotten me. I found it difficult to leave the house. Aunt, Neil Webster is there, and of course I have had to attend to him." "I heard the young man was back again," she said in a muffled voice, "and truly, I wonder that my brother should have him in the house. Why shouldn't he? Neil is a good fellow, but his mother is not a good woman. She belongs to the criminal classes." "My dear aunt," cried Ruth, "I am sure the poor woman is more sinned against than sinning." "What do you know of her?" asked the good lady, turning a terrible eye on her niece. "Has your father?" "Yes, he has, and I found out a great deal for myself. I am sure Mrs. Jenner did not kill her husband." "You know nothing at all about it." "Mrs. Jenner was a minx. I knew her well when she lived at Hollyoaks and taught Amy. I lived there myself, and managed the house, too, for your poor mother never did have any idea of how to conduct an establishment. Mrs. Jenner, a bold, bad woman. She came down to Westham after the arrest of her abominable husband, and lived at the Turnpike House. And there her husband called to see her on the night he was murdered. On the night she murdered him," corrected Mrs. Marshall vehemently. "Will you be wiser than the law, Ruth? I tell you it was she who struck the blow. I do not say that she had not good cause, for the man was a brute. But she had no right to take his life." She didn't," asseverated Ruth, with quite as much vehemence as her aunt had shown. "The blow was struck through the window for the sake of getting a red. Why, whatever is the matter, aunt?" "Nothing, nothing," gasped Mrs. Marshall. She had seated herself suddenly on a convenient box, and with her hand to her side, was gazing at her niece with an ashen face. "A stitch in the side, that's all, child." Why did your father tell you all this, and what does he know about the red pocketbook? I have heard scraps of information at times, said Ruth, trying to get out of the unpleasant position in which her tongue had placed her. But I know very little. I don't want to have anything to do with the matter. Please don't ask me anything more about it, Aunt. You have said so much that I must know all, said Mrs. Marshall, so fiercely that the girl was frightened. If you refuse to tell me, I shall speak to your father. He is the very best person to whom you could speak, replied Miss Cass, with some defiance in her voice, for her temper was rising at her aunt's tone. But please don't bring me into it. I shall act as I think best. If this case has been reopened as I judge from your words, it has been why was I not informed? I refer you to Papa, said Ruth coldly. And after all, she added, I do not see what you have to do with it. Aunt Inez. More than you think, replied Mrs. Marshall, tightening her thin lips. Then Ruth did a very foolish thing, a thing she repented of for many a long day after. What about Job? She asked. Does he also take an interest in the case? Mrs. Marshall sprang forward in the most dramatic fashion and seized her niece by the arm. You have been asking him questions, she said. And what if I have? Cried the girl, twisting herself away. Anyone has a right to ask questions, I suppose? But he told me nothing. He had nothing to tell. In that case, you need not look so fiercely at me, Aunt. Mrs. Marshall realized how indiscreet was her demeanor. Don't trouble about me, child, she said, with a forced laugh. I have done nothing to be ashamed of. I never thought you had, Aunt. Mrs. Jenner, continued Aunt Inez, exactly as though she were repeating a lesson, was a flirt. When she married a brute, she only got her just punishment. I did my best to be kind to her, but I always hated her. It is no use my denying the fact I did hate her. If you are a woman, Ruth, if you have your grandmother's blood in your veins, you will understand. Oh yes, said the girl, proudly conscious of her own tiger blood. I can quite understand. I should like to see any woman take Geoffrey from me. Ah! And she growled like a playful cat. I believe Mrs. Jenner killed her husband, continued Aunt Inez, taking no notice of this speech, and she is being punished for it. As to Job, I merely assist him out of charity. He knows nothing about the murder. It had happened before he came to these parts. Now, are you satisfied? My dear aunt, I never wanted to be satisfied, replied the girl. I never thought you knew anything about the murder. I don't. I swear I don't, cried Mrs. Marshall. But this red pocketbook, it was not mentioned at the trial. I know nothing about it, said Ruth promptly. She was not going to be drawn into the discussion. Ask Papa about it. Mrs. Marshall, seeing she would get nothing further out of her niece, returned to the examination of the lumber which was scattered over the floor of the garret. Then we will go down shortly and have some tea, my dear, she said in her most amiable tone. She was evidently desirous of effacing the impression of her former fierceness. Ruth wondered but little at her aunt's strange demeanor. In a meditative way, she watched Mrs. Marshall moving about on the other side of the garret, so close under the slope of the roof that her head touched it. There were 2 windows, one at each end, but these were so dirty that the place was enveloped in a kind of brown twilight which had, at first, prevented the girl from seeing plainly. As her eyes grew more accustomed to the semi-gloom, she examined the lumber that was piled up on all sides. All the scum of the house had risen to the top and been left in this isolated attic. It was filled with the wreckage which will accumulate even in the most orderly houses. There were, also, ancient books, piles of newspapers, and such-like things huddled together pell-mell, and over all lay a thick gray dust. Suddenly, as Ruth, growing tired of waiting, shifted her position, the light from the window behind struck out a patch of red. Her eyes wandered mechanically towards the color. It was the red morocco binding of a narrow book which protruded from the heap. Hardly thinking what she was doing, the girl picked it up, and with the light from behind her strong upon it, she examined it minutely. Then her heart seemed to stand still, for it was a pocketbook, perhaps the very red pocketbook which had been stolen by Jenner's murderer, and of which they had been speaking only a few minutes before. Anxious to make quite certain as to this, Ruth slipped off the elastic strap and examined the discolored leaves. For the most part they were blank, but written on the front page was a name, and the name was Jenner. At the sight, Ruth uttered a cry. Mrs. Marshall turned sharply. Chapter 25. The Red Pocketbook. "What is the matter, child?" asked Mrs. Marshall sharply. But Ruth could not answer. She sat with the red pocketbook in her lap, gazing upon it as though it were a viper. Aunt Inez repeated her question impatiently then, surprised at her niece's silence. She crossed the garret. Her eyes fell at once on the red book, and for a few seconds no word was spoken. Then at last Ruth made a remark, and made it in a hushed voice, as though she feared it might be heard by others than the frozen woman before her. "It was not produced at the trial," was what she said, looking at her aunt. Mrs. Marshall might have been a granite image for all the movement she made. Her face was like snow, her eyes fixed as though she were in a cataleptic state. And so, she was for the moment. Only when Ruth, who was the first to recover herself, made a motion to rise did she shew any signs of life. She sighed deeply and removed her eyes from the book. "I will shew it to my father," said the girl, whereat her aunt changed suddenly into a creature of fire. She snatched at the pocketbook and had it in her grasp before Ruth could close her fingers upon it. "You will shew it to no one," she said, thrusting it into her pocket. "I forbid you to say a word. Tell me how it came to be here, and I will consider if it is right for me to be silent. I will explain nothing. Girl, what demon brought you here and shewed you that book?" "I came up here to look for it. I have been searching for over an hour. You came in and found it in a few minutes. It is fate. Aunt Inez." Ruth drew back until she was standing up against the wall. "You oh no. You did not kill the man." Mrs. Marshall shrugged her shoulders, her color and her courage coming back to her almost as she spoke. "You are at liberty to think so if you like. I will not contradict you. No, indeed. I have other things to do. Will you contradict my father? I forbid you to tell your father of this. I must. I will know the truth of this matter. There is an innocent woman in jail for—" "An innocent woman," interrupted her aunt with contempt. "Oh yes, very innocent." She paused and looked at Ruth. "Come downstairs," she said. "As you have found what I wanted, we need not remain here. You knew that this book was hidden here?" "Yes, I have known it for years. Why did you not produce it at the trial?" "That is my business. How did it come into your possession?" "Ah, that I refuse to tell you. Think me guilty if you like. It is evident you want to smirch our family name. But I have had enough of this nonsense. You must hold your tongue. To all persons save my father. I must tell him, and I will. I forbid you. It is no use your forbidding me. I tell my father. He has the honor of the family quite as at heart as you have, and he is the man to decide what should be done. You will tell." "Yes, I am going straight home to tell all." The eyes of the two women met, and for a moment there was a duel of wills. Then Ruth, with her more youthful fire, got the upper hand. Her aunt turned away. "You are bringing me into great danger," she said, "but have it your own way. Tell your father." "Aunt, you did not kill the man. Think so if you like." Mrs. Marshall passed out of the garret. Ruth remained a moment to recover her self-control, which had been sorely shaken by this extraordinary conversation. Then she also went down the stairs to the inhabited portion of the house. Mrs. Marshall was not to be seen, and on inquiring of the servant, Ruth learnt that she had locked herself in her bedroom and refused to see anyone. In this dilemma, there was nothing left for the girl but to go home, which she proceeded to do feeling sick at heart. On the way to Hollyoaks, a sudden thought struck her. Suppose her aunt were guilty, suppose she had shut herself in her room to commit suicide. If she had not been almost at the gates of the park when this occurred to her, she would have run back. But the best thing she could do now was to see her father and implore him to go to Aunt Inez at once. She felt there was no time to be lost and ran up the avenue as quickly as she could. The window of the library, which opened onto the terrace, was ajar. So taking this as a short cut, she ran up the steps onto the terrace and flung herself into the room with a white and haggard face. "Ruth, what is the matter?" "Ruth!" cried Mr. Cass, and sprang forward just in time to catch her in his arms. For a minute or so she could not speak, but when speech did come the words poured out in a torrent. "Aunt Inez," she cried. "I want to see her. She was in the garret. There I found the red pocketbook, Jenner's book, which was stolen. She will not say if she killed him, yet she knew that the book was in the garret. Oh, see her at once, father, at once. She has locked herself in her bedroom. I believe that she will kill herself, and the excited girl burst into tears of exhaustion and terror. Mr. Cass said nothing, but put her into a chair. Indeed, he did not know what to say, or even what to think, for he felt completely stunned. He had suspected Marshall, but never Inez. Even now, he did not believe that she could ever have brought herself to commit such a crime. "Go, go," cried Ruth, wringing her hands. "Aunt Inez, you may be too late. She will kill herself. I know she will." "No fear of that," said her father, recovering himself somewhat. "She is not the woman to give up the fight in that way, Inez. No, she never killed that beast, never. But, father, the red pocketbook. She will be able to explain how she came by it. She has a temper, and is fierce enough when she is roused, but she would not go so far as that. As to committing suicide, she has no reason for doing that, if she is innocent. I hope she is. Oh, I hope she is," wailed Ruth, distracted with terror. Her father saw that the girl was thoroughly overwrought. In her present state of mind, everything would be exaggerated. He intended to go at once and learn the truth from his sister, but he could not leave Ruth in this plight. Before he went, he must soothe her. So, pulling himself together, no easy task, at his age, for he had received a severe shock, he sat down beside the terrified girl and took her hand firmly in his own. "See here, child," he said, "however that book got into Marshall's hands, your aunt had nothing to do with it. She could not have killed Jenner. I know it because she was in this house on the night and at the time of the murder. Then if she is innocent, why didn't she tell me so? Well, you know what she is. No doubt she was angry to think you should conceive her capable of such a crime. She will tell me all she knows, if she has any knowledge, which I am inclined to doubt. But I want you to understand, Ruth, that your aunt is innocent, and that her innocence can be proved by me. Under these circumstances, she will not commit suicide, as you appear to think. I will go over and see her at once, and I shall doubtless have a reassuring report to give you when I return. But you must promise not to worry while I am away. And above all things, Ruth, do not tell anyone of this. There may be trouble." "I will say nothing, panted the girl, pressing her hands against her beating heart. "And indeed, father, I did not meddle with the matter again. The discovery was thrust upon me. You can trust me. Indeed you can. And you will not make yourself ill with expecting the worst?" No. I promise I will go to my room and lie down. That's a good girl. And I will walk over at once. Ride. You don't know what may happen. Nothing bad, at all events. Yes, I will ride. Now go to your room, dear, and leave me to attend to this." "Yes, father," she said faintly. She had the utmost belief in his capability of arranging the situation. "But kiss me before you go. I am rather frightened." "Believe me, there is no need for that," said Mr. Cass, with an attempt at a smile. "There is your kiss, now go." Mr. Cass reviewed the whole situation as he rode over to his sister's house. He reflected that Marshall must have told his wife about the bill, for that and the book were, so to speak, inseparable. In a word, thought Mr. Cass, as he dismounted at the door and gave his horse to a groom, Marshall did not kill the man himself, but he knows who did. But I'll make Inez tell truth in some way. This is no time to consider her feelings. Following the servant, he went into the stone-colored drawing room and found his sister waiting to receive him. She was dressed in black, without a scrap of white to relieve her funereal aspect. "I did not expect you to come so soon, Sebastian," she said, in her rich, low voice. "But I knew you would come sooner or later. I could hardly help coming after what Ruth told me." Her brother was surprised at her composure. "What did she tell you?" "That the red pocketbook belonging to Jenner had been found by her in this house. To be particular, the garret," said Mrs. Marshall, pointing to the table. "There it is." He looked at it with repugnance and touched it gingerly. Then he opened it, glanced at the name, and laid it down with a sigh. There was no doubt it had been Jenner's property. The name was clear enough. "How did it come into your possession?" he asked sharply. "That is not an easy question for me to answer. Yet it can be answered and must be answered." "How do you know that I will comply with your must?" she asked with scorn. "Oh, I know you are hard to drive, but in this case you must speak out. I have the means to make you. That is, if you have any regard for your husband. You know how I love him, little as he deserves it. You were talking of the bill. Oh, don't look so astonished. Frank told me of his conversation with you. It was by my advice that he went away. Inez, is it possible you can love so base a creature? Mrs. Marshall sighed. To you, Sebastian, I will say things I would not say to any other person. Little as we love one another, still we are brother and sister. I know you would do much for me. I would do anything for you, Inez. Blood is stronger than water, after all. And you can speak freely to me. Your honor is my honor. I can hold my tongue. Speak out freely, he repeated. I will, she said, and gave him the kindest look that had been in her eyes for many a long year. You know how madly in love I was with Frank when I married him. It was not love. It was infatuation. I believed him to be the most perfect and the most misunderstood man in the whole world. I blamed you for getting him out of the business, and I thought to repair your wrong by marrying him. Well, I did. And then what happened? I can guess. The scales fell from your eyes. They did within 6 months. For even then he deceived me. Yes, after all I had done for him. I had made him rich. I had, but that comes later on in the story. Suffice it to say that I soon found out that I had married a faithless brute. Why did you not get rid of him? I would have helped you. She cast a look around the dismal room and smiled strangely. Because I had committed a sin. I came to look upon Frank as the cross laid upon me for the expiation of that sin. Good heavens, Inez! You don't mean to say you killed Jenner? No. What nonsense am I talking? You were in bed on that night. I did not kill Jenner, she said calmly. Nevertheless, I had committed a sin. You shall hear all in good time. Well, I took Frank as my cross and put up all these years with his infidelities and drunkenness and wickedness. I behaved to him as though I still loved him. I have deceived everyone. You certainly deceived me for one, said Mr. Cass bluntly. I thought you still loved the creature. Loved him? Why, I hated him with all my soul. It was only my religious principles and my desire to expiate my sin that made me tolerate him. In heaven's name, what is your sin? I'll tell you soon enough, she said, but do not be afraid. I have not dipped my hands in blood. Let me tell my story in my own way. It is not easy for me to tell it at all. I only do so now in order to avert worse trouble. Knowing her obstinacy, her brother saw that it was useless to protest. Go on, he said, leaning back in his chair. Have your own way. I often wish we had kept to our mother's faith, continued Mrs. Marshall. She was of the true church, and Catholicism is such a comforting religion. One has a confessor. That would have done me good. I have often longed to confess and relieve my mind. Why did you not confess to me? I had no reason for making you my confidant, Sebastian, she said, icily. Well, I was of the Protestant faith and could not confess, so I had to bear my own sorrow as best I could. Frank tried me at times with his dreadful ways, but I had a whip to manage him. What was the whip? Asked Mr. Cass, struck by the fact that she used almost the same phrase that he had used to her husband. I will tell you shortly, but I mortified my flesh in every way. Look at this house. You know how I love pretty things, and yet I spend my life in the midst of these horrors. I am fond of... See here, Inez, broke in her brother, I want to know about this pocketbook. You can tell me your feelings later. Chapter 26. The Penance of Inez. Sebastian's abrupt interruption of his sister's enthusiastic confession was as a douche of cold water on glowing iron. The iron forthwith cooled. That is to say, Mrs. Marshall, from flesh and blood, became stone again. Of course I will tell you all you wish to know, she said, in even tones, with about as much feeling as might have been expected from a cuckoo. But since you will not let me tell my story in my own way, I think it is best that you should put your own questions. Then I shall know precisely what you do want. Don't be angry, entreated her brother, but tell me all for the sake of the family. Where did you learn that Frank had committed forgery? At the Wagoner's Pond. Mr. Cass started from his seat and stared down at his sister in surprise. He remembered what Marshall had told him about that appointment at the Wagoner's Pond. What? He cried. Were you out on the night of the murder? Did you overhear the conversation between Marshall and Jenner? Oh, it was Jenner, was it? She said quite composedly. Well, I guessed as much, though I could never be quite sure. Didn't your husband tell you that he had met him by the Wagoner's Pond? She looked up with scorn and contempt. Frank never told me anything but what was wrung out of him by fear. Besides, we did not speak of these things. Like him, I preferred to let sleeping dogs lie. Her brother had taken his seat again, and, deep in thought, paid little attention to what she was saying. I thought you were in bed on that night, with a headache? A woman's excuse, she said coolly. I had no headache, but I had a very keen desire to find out why Frank had an appointment on that night, and with whom. I suspected another woman. You can guess her name. Mrs. Jenner? Ah, but he did not go out to meet her, cried Mr. Cass impatiently. He had an appointment with her husband. I found that out later. But I heard him asking one of the servants where the wagoner's pond was, and if he could find it in the dark. I knew then that he intended to go there that night for some purpose. The name of Mrs. Jenner was not mentioned, but as she was in the neighborhood, well, you know what a woman's feelings are. You jump to conclusions? Yes, they were wrong, but that did not matter. At all events, I was satisfied that he did not meet the woman. I slipped out of a side door, unknown to everyone. My headache was a pretext that I might be at the meeting place. Had he done so, I would have broken off the engagement, yes. Much as I loved him, or rather, much as I was infatuated, I would have broken it off at the 11th hour had he put such an insult on me. And yet you married him? Oh, what is the use of that paracry? She said impatiently. You have already said that 5 or 6 times. Because I am so amazed that your pride did not come to your aid when you knew the use to which he intended to put your money. To him you were not the woman he loved, but the banker upon whom he intended to draw. And yet I married him, she said, with a cold smile. Women are strange creatures, I confess. Yet you always considered me proud. See how mistaken you were. I had more weakness than you thought me capable of possessing. I was wildly, madly in love with him. At all events, I intended to marry him. And what is more, I intended to get back that incriminating bill from Jenner without the expenditure of a penny. I saw that he had replaced it in his red pocketbook. Well, I made up my mind that I would get that pocketbook. Yet you never guessed the man was Jenner, remarked her brother, ironically. I was suspicious, but not certain. However, I did not go after Jenner at once, for I knew where to find him. I wanted Frank to be out of the way. Before I left my hiding place, I was behind a hedge and not alone. What do you mean by that? Asked Mr. Cass, startled. I mean what I say. Several times, while I was crouching in the wet grass, I heard the breathing of someone no great distance off. Well, I found that other person. When some time afterwards? On the contrary, the person threw himself in my way within half an hour after I was on my way to the Turnpike House. Wait a moment, cried Mr. Cass, with suppressed excitement. I know who it was, the gypsy job. Ah, replied Mrs. Marshall, without betraying much surprise. Ruth told you something. Geoffrey did. Ruth had told him. Mrs. Marshall rose with a bound. And pray what has Mr. Heron to do with this matter? A good deal, rejoined her brother drily. You may as well sit down, Inez. Geoffrey is perfectly discreet. He is going to marry Ruth. You know, it will be as much to his interest as mine to keep this affair secret. Well, so you met this gypsy blackguard? Yes, halfway on the road to the Turnpike House. In spite of the darkness and the mist, he knew me in a moment instinct, I suppose. How could he have met you? Had you met him before? Lots of times. I knew the Romany dialect and used to talk to Job. I really wonder at you, Inez, taking up with such scum. As for Ruth, I'll talk to her. She shall have nothing more to do with him. Oh, as to that, remarked his sister, shrugging her shoulders, the creature is dying. He is consumptive and is drinking himself to death. I have placed him in the Turnpike House without Mr. Heron's permission, by the way, and I allow him a small sum a week so that he may die in peace. So that you may keep your secret. You mean, it will soon be a secret no longer. Job, as I say, knew me. He told me that he had been sleeping behind the hedge near me, I suppose, and had been aroused by the sound of voices. He recognized Frank's voice, for he had often spoken to him. But Jenner he did not know, any more than I did. Naturally, Jenner was a comparative stranger in these parts. Go on. Well, Job had heard all about the red pocketbook and the bill. I saw in a twinkling that here was the instrument I required. I promised him £20 if he would get me that red pocketbook. Inez, did you send the man to murder Jenner? No, I did not. I never thought he would goose so far as that. And as a matter of fact, Job has always denied to me that he struck the blow. He certainly would tell you that to save his neck. Well, after I had made this arrangement with him and had told him that Jenner was at the Turnpike House, I returned home. I entered by the side door and slipped up to my room without anyone being the wiser. I certainly was not, said her brother. You are quite a diplomatist, Inez. What about Job's murdering mission? He did not commit the murder, insisted Mrs. Marshall. He came next day and brought me the pocketbook. I opened it, but could not find the bill. Then I accused Job of having taken it. He grinned, but would say nothing. You understand, Sebastian, he had not got the bill, but he wanted to have me in his power. I see. But you could have turned the tables on him by having him arrested for the crime. No, he knew of the bill of Frank's disgrace. I thought, if he were arrested, he would tell all, which he certainly would have done. Then Frank would have been prosecuted. Remember, I thought Job had the bill. All these years I have believed he had it in his possession. You do not know the blackmail I have paid that man. He was always worrying me for money. At last, seeing he was ill, I put him into the Turnpike House, and well, I have told you all that. But now you know why I assisted him. Assisted a murderer? Job denied that he had killed the man. Then how did he get the pocketbook? He said that he had met Jenner before he got to the Turnpike House and robbed him of the book. That is a lie, cried Mr. Cass, and a feeble lie to boot. Jenner had the book when he was in that room before he was killed. Mrs. Jenner said that the book was on the table near the window. And my own opinion is that the blow must have been struck through the window and the book stolen. But why believe Mrs. Jenner more than Job? I will tell you all. The bill was in the pocketbook. You yourself saw Jenner put it there. Well, he thought Marshall might steal that bill, so he sewed it up in the body of a toy horse with which his child was playing. Neil kept the horse, and a short time ago, he sent it to George, who cut the animal open. The bill was found, and is now in my possession. So, you see, Job could not have taken the pocketbook which contained the bill before Jenner got to the house. He must have murdered the man and stolen the book after the bill had been placed inside the horse. But nothing of all this came out at the trial. No one knew anything about it, least of all Mrs. Jenner. But now you are satisfied that Job committed that murder? I suppose so. It looks like it. Oh, the wretch, to let me think all these years that he had the bill, and that he was innocent of killing the man. Had you no suspicion of his guilt? She thought for a moment. I confess I had, she said after a pause. But, you see, I had to put all such suspicions behind my back. If I had denounced Job, I thought he would have produced the bill and ruined Frank. I see. Well, here is the bill. No one knows of it but Heron, and he will say nothing. I thought of keeping it as a useful whip for your husband, should he treat you cruelly. But now that I find you do not care for him, I think it had better be destroyed. No, she said, putting it in her pocket, I will keep it, to hold over Frank myself. I hate him, and would gladly divorce him, which I could easily do. But I am as proud of the family name as you are, and I do not want a scandal. So I shall not separate from him. But now I shall know how to make him behave himself. She tapped her pocket with a grim smile. Did you ever speak to him about the red pocketbooks? No, he never knew I had it. I put it away, and afterward sent it up to the garret, where I thought it would be safe. Hardly anyone ever goes there but myself. Besides, if I had told Frank, he would have worried Job about giving him the bill, and heaven only knows what would have happened then. No, I was wrong, I suppose, but I acted for the best. When Frank told me that he had seen you, and that the bill was in your possession, I went up to the garret, intending to find the pocketbook and destroy it. Then I was foolish enough to ask Ruth. She found it by chance, and well, you know the rest. Yes, I know the rest, said Mr. Cass grimly, and among other things, I know that Job Lovell killed Jenner, and that the dead man's unhappy wife has been punished all these years. Inez, I know you always hated her, but would you have let her lose her life? No, if she had been in danger of that, I would have come forward and told all I knew, even at the cost of disgrace. I would not have had the blood of a fellow creature on my soul. But, to tell you the truth, Sebastian, as Mrs. Jenner did not defend herself, I really believe she was guilty and Job innocent. He confessed to having robbed Jenner. She would say nothing. So of the two, I thought Job the innocent one. Can you blame me? Partly. I blame you for not having told me this long ago. I always suspected your husband. Now I know that he is innocent, and I should have known it all along, seeing that he was in my house when the crime was committed. If you had spoken out, I would have managed to get Mrs. Jenner off in some way without exposing the whole of this dreadful story. Job should be punished. Think what that would mean to us all, said his sister, warningly. I will contrive to evade the worst. But I must have that poor woman released. Chapter 27. A Doubtful Witness. His sister's attitude puzzled Mr. Cass less than might have been expected. On leaving her, he went straight to the Turnpike House to interview the gypsy. The first thing was to get the truth out of Job. Then he would try to arrive at some settlement of the question which would be satisfactory to the world, to justice, and to his conscience. The door of the house was closed when he rode up. He dismounted, gave his horse to his groom, and told the man to take him home. I have to see this gypsy, he explained. I find he is here without Mr. Heron's permission. I shall probably remain some time, and I don't want Sultan to get cold. Go home. Yes, sir, said the man, and then ventured to add a few words on his own account. Shan't I wait, sir? Joe Lovell is a rough customer. I know, Mr. Cass said calmly. I am prepared for that. I shall return in an hour, more or less. If Mr. Heron should come to Hollyoaks, ask him to wait for me. The man rode off, leading his master's horse. Mr. Cass waited until they were out of sight, then knocked vigorously at the door. There was no response. A third knock, or rather a perfect battery of knocks, proved that Job was at home. From within came the growl of a waking beast, a beast angry at being disturbed. And shortly afterwards the door was wrenched open by no very gentle hand. The gypsy, with his red-rimmed eyes blinking from under a thatch of disordered hair, stood on the threshold. Mr. Cass took in his condition at a glance. "Are you not ashamed to be drunk at this time of day?" he asked. "What do you mean by it?" "It is none of your business," growled Job, who had slept off the worst effects of his debauch. "It is my business. I am Mr. Cass." "I know you are," retorted the man, still blocking the doorway. "But that doesn't give you the right to come knocking at my door. 'Tisn't your house." "It is Mr. Heron's house," Mr. Cass said sharply, "and I have sufficient influence with Mr. Heron to have you kicked out into the cold if you do not behave yourself." "I shouldn't do that if I were you," said the ruffian with a sinister smile. "Others may find themselves out in the cold too. I, my gorgeous Gentile bigger folk, nor the poor Romany." This was plainly a threat leveled at Mrs. Marshall, as her brother clearly saw. However, it was not his intention to quarrel with the man until he had got the truth out of him. "You speak in riddles," he said, "but perhaps you will stand aside and let me enter." "What for?" asked Job suspiciously. "You shall hear my business when I am within." The gypsy began to cough, and the paroxysm was so violent that he had to hold on to the doorpost. "Well, sir," said Job at length, somewhat sobered by a fit of coughing, "come in. I ain't the one to keep a Romany rye out of my tent." Mr. Cass entered, and followed the man into the sitting room in which Jenner had been murdered by, so far as Mr. Cass knew, its present occupant. As he entered, he became conscious of a strong smell of petroleum, and, making a sudden pause, "Have you upset your lamp?" he asked. "No, I ain't upset anything," said Job sulkily. "The smell, is it? Oh, that's my business. I've got an idea that ain't nothing to do with you. Sit down and tell me what's the row. I know, though. It's your young lady. Well, I haven't done her no harm. She's a sister to me because she patters the black lingo. Has she been setting your back up, Rye?" "My visit has nothing to do with Miss Cass," said her father, sharply. "Leave her name out of the question. I know all about her visit to you and how you behaved. I am not blaming you. But my business here has to do with a very serious matter. Perhaps you can guess my errand when I tell you that I come from Mrs. Marshall." The mere mention of that name drove the remaining fumes of drink from the gypsy's head, and he cast a sharp glance at his visitor. Mr. Cass sustained this scrutiny with the greatest calmness, and finding the smell of the petroleum quite unbearable, threw open the window and placed his chair close beside it so that he could breathe freely. Then he turned round and looked again at the man. Job, open-mouthed at these liberties taken with his domestic arrangements, stared insolently at Mr. Cass. But at length he found his tongue. "You'll give me my death," he grumbled. "I want that window shut." You shall not have it shut, then, said Mr. Cass, coolly. The air here is horrible with the smell of that petroleum, whatever you are doing with it. Sit down over there, and you will be out of the draft. I have something serious to say to you. So you said before, growled Job, surrendering the point of the window and pitching himself onto a broken-back chair. What's she up to now? If you are speaking of Mrs. Marshall, be more respectful, Mr. Cass said angrily. However you may have intimidated her, you ruffian, you cannot deal with me in the same way. I'll make an example of you. Ha! Ha! You touch me at your peril, retorted Job, who was getting exasperated. At your peril? You mean? Now then, my man, no equivocation, but a plain confession. Out with it. Confession? What have I to confess, my Gentile cove? Be respectful, I tell you, or I'll lay my whip across your shoulders. What have you to confess about, you ask? If the walls of this shambles could speak, they might tell you. Not but what you know well enough what I mean. Ah, cried the man, his eyes glittering. She's blown the gaff. Precisely. And it should have been blown long ago. You blackmailing beast. Now then, I'm here to learn the truth. Oh, she's not told it to you then? Yes, she has. But I want to confirm by you. What am I to confirm? Asked the gypsy, with a savage oath. The story of how you murdered Jenner in this room. He started from his seat with a howl, and flung himself towards Mr. Cass. But the merchant was ready for this, and pushing back his chair, sprang to his feet. Job found himself recoiling before the barrel of a revolver. You get back to your seat, or I'll blow your brains out, said Mr. Cass, and said it with such ferocity that the ruffian crawled back like a whipped dog. But then, Mr. Cass had the blood of many a slave-owning Spaniard in his veins, and was much more savage than an ordinary Anglo-Saxon. Do you think I would trust myself here without protection, you wretch? He asked, resuming his seat. No, you move, and I shoot. I am less English than Spanish, let me tell you. And perhaps I do not consider my actions so carefully as the people of this country. You're a fierce one. You are, anyway, grumbled the man, climbing up to his seat with an uneasy eye on the weapon which still covered him. My sister is just like you. Plucky as a bantam, she is. Which sister do you mean, Mrs. Marshall or Miss Cass? You have two, you know, adopted sisters? Oh, she told you that, did she? Said Job, rubbing his head, and evidently perplexed at the extent of his visitor's knowledge. Well, it seems you know a lot, you do. Enough to hang you, was the curt reply. That's a lie, shouted Job. I didn't lay a finger on him. Then how did you become possessed of a red pocketbook? The gypsy started, and gave Mr. Cass another of his keen glances. He did not reply immediately, but seemed to be reflecting. At length, how do I know you are not laying a trap for me? The business I had with the high-born Gentile lady concerns her only. She has not told me to speak of hidden things to you. If you don't tell me, and tell me quickly too, you will have to reply to a magistrate. What magistrate, Rye? The one before whom I will bring you, was the quiet answer. Understand that I have sufficient evidence in my possession to have you arrested on suspicion of having murdered the man Jenner. For reasons which you will doubtless appreciate, I am willing to deal gently with you. But, he raised a threatening finger, only on condition that you make a clean breast of all to me and at once. Anything you do to me, Rye, will harm your sister. I hold something which can break her heart. The bill of exchange you heard Marshall talking about to Jenner? Job fell back in amazement. You do know all? Yes. I hold the bill, the forged bill which can put in prison. No one. That is quite enough. You need tell no more lies. You got possession of the pocketbook. Yes. And I took the bill out before I gave it to the lady. I see, said Mr. Cass tranquilly, although he marveled at the daring of the man. And you made use of your assertion that you had possession of the bill to blackmail Mrs. Marshall's? I only got a little money out of her, my Gentile. She has been kind to me, and she has given me this house to die in. Then the sooner you die, the better. You are no good to anyone, so far as I can see. You scoundrel. To blackmail a lady. She believe you, I do not. You don't believe I have the bill? Asked Job, incredulously. No, for if you had, you would shew it to me. I will not. Why should I? You cannot shew it to me. I thought as much. Hey, you think so, Rye? Then if I haven't the bill, who has? Mrs. Marshall. for I gave it to her today. It is a lie. A lie. Job was quite pale now. He saw that his last card was played, and that he had now very little hold but still some over Mrs. Marshall. It the truth. The bill was taken out of that pocketbook by Jenner in this room, and placed in hiding. I need not explain where. It is sufficient for you to know that the bill came into my possession, and that I gave it to my sister. Your teeth are drawn, tiger. The gypsy saw that he was beaten, and began to whine. Although he already bore the impress of death, he did not want to be turned out to die in the open fields. What do you want to know, Honorable Rye? He asked, in fawning tones, for he wanted to propitiate the man who could make a tramp of him. I will tell you all. You know so much that— Now then, interrupted Mr. Cass, impatiently, where did you get the red pocketbook? Did you snatch it through this window, at which I am sitting, and kill Jenner to get it? No, Rye, I swear I did not. I was not near this house. I got the pocketbook from Jenner. You liar! The bill was in the book when Jenner came to this house, and if you had stolen it, the bill would have remained there. Jenner did not leave the house again. He died here. Job scratched his head. He was puzzled. Well, I thought it was Jenner, Rye. If it wasn't him, then who was it? Marshall, you attacked Marshall on that night. Oh, I know. You tore his cuff and stole his sleeve links, and one was found under this very window. You dropped it there. You murderer. I ain't a murderer, I tell you, growled the man, getting angry. I did try to get some tin out of that Marshall cove, but that was afore I met Mrs. Marshall. I was sleeping behind a hedge, and I heard Marshall and Jenner jawing. I listened, and heard all. When they parted, I thought I'd drop on Marshall, Rye, and get some money. I was poor, and he was rich. He put out his arms to fight, and I did grab his wrist, but I didn't steal his links, I swear. Then I heard someone coming, and I ran away. While he went home, I came back to the Wagoner's Pond, and then followed the lady. I knew she was hiding not far from me in the hedge. How could you tell that? In the mist and darkness. I've eyes like a cat and can see through stones, said Job in a sulky tone. Black don't make no difference to me. I knew her, I tell you, Rye, and thought she'd go after Jenner and get that bill for Marshall's sake. Why for Marshall's sake? Asked Mr. Cass, coldly. 'Cause I heard she was going to be his Ronnie marry him, as you Gentiles call it. I went after her, and caught her up. I offered to do the job for money. She said she'd give me lots if I got her the pocketbook. I said I'd give it her next day. Then I came to this house where we are now, and waited in the hedge on the other side of the road. I saw the winder was open, but nothing more. There was a cry and a yell, and a cove comes dashing down the road. I after him, and caught him up, though he run like the wind. I fell on him, and I said, "Give us the red pocketbooks." He fought but said nothing. I thought he was Jenner. Oh, but you could see in the dark, remarked Mr. Cass sarcastically. What did that matter? Job said, surlily. I didn't know Jenner when I saw him. He was a stranger to me. True enough, said Mr. Cass. Go on. Well, he fought and twisted, and I grabbed onto his throat, then he half gave in, and pushed the pocketbook further into his pocket. I held him down and got it out. I didn't know he'd been knifing Jenner. I took the pocketbook to an old barn where I was going to sleep for the night, and looked through it. I couldn't find no bill, and thought I'd had all my trouble for nothing. So thinking she'd give me no money, I made up my mind as I'd tell her I'd got the bill and would keep it till she paid up. She believed the yarn, and I saw she was afraid. She asked me to shew her the bill, but I said I wouldn't, as she might put it in the burning fire. In one way or another I made her think I could do her husband harm with the bill, so she paid up well. Oh, yes, said the scoundrel, generously. I will say she was a real gentle lady, and all the time you hadn't the bill. You beast. Job slapped his thigh. That's the joke of it, he said, and began to cough again. Mr. Cass watched him with an expression of contempt. The secret of the murder seemed as far off as ever, like an elusive phantom. It flitted just within reach. But when the seer hoped to grasp it, it was still the same distance ahead. Twice or thrice had Mr. Cass been on the verge of solving the mystery, and now again it was impenetrable as always before. He saw no reason to doubt this man's story, yet he was doubtful. He made one more attempt to get at the truth. Who was this man you struggled with? He asked. I don't know. I could not see much of him because we were fighting hard, my Rye. but I've often thought he was the same cove as I heard the steps of when I tussled with Marshall. How could you tell that? I can't tell, Rye, was the candid response, but I feel it was the same. When I heard of the murder next morning, I knew he'd killed Jenner to get that pocketbook, but the lady, she said she didn't know. I told her it was Jenner, and she thought I'd tackled him going to the house, but it was when the man had left the house, and then Jenner was inside it. Mr. Cass had by this time learnt as much as he was capable of taking in, and the mystery of the murder was deeper than ever. He resolved that he would go away and think the matter over quietly. I will go now, he said. And give me up to the peelers? Asked Job with a scowl. No, I am doubtful now if you're guilty. I cannot say, but I shall not tell the police just now. I will see you again. One thing, don't go near Mrs. Marshall. And he left his brain in a perfect whirl. Won't I just? Growled Job. I'll get some more money out of her and cut the country. No, I won't. Here he sniffed the petroleum. I'll try that game first. The Gentiles chuck me. The Romany won't have me. There ain't nothing but that. He sniffed again, for poor Job, and he swore. Chapter 28. The unexpected happens. Geoffrey was at Hollyoaks when Mr. Cass arrived home. He had come over simply to see Ruth, never dreaming that any further revelations about the case awaited him. But his host lost no time, and at once invited him and Neil Webster into the library. There he left them for a moment while he went upstairs to see his daughter and tell her that all was well with her aunt. You need not trouble your head, my dear, he said. Your aunt got that pocketbook from Job, who, here for obvious reasons, he suppressed the truth, who picked it up on the road. Now, is your mind at rest? Completely. She kissed her father fondly. But Geoffrey, I sent down to say that I was ill. He will be disappointed. I will speak to him. Meanwhile, try and get some sleep. You can see him another time. In this way, he managed to set her mind at rest. Then he returned to the library to have the matter out with the two young men. He found a letter lying on the table, and, making some excuse, opened it at once. For he had become so accustomed now to the occurrence of unforeseen events that the sight of an envelope addressed in an unknown hand made him anxious lest it should bring some new element of trouble. Ah, Neil, he said, as he ran his eyes over the contents, this is from the prison chaplain. Your mother wishes to see me. Can I go with you? Asked the young man, rousing himself. I think not. She told you to keep away, and it is only right that you should obey her. Tomorrow I will go up, and when I return you shall know all that has passed between us. Meantime, I have a painful story to tell you and Geoffrey. Oh, said Heron quickly. More about this case? Yes. I think we are getting near the truth now. I have made several important discoveries. By the way, Geoffrey, Ruth will see you tomorrow. She is not very well, in fact. She had rather a severe shock today. This confounded case, of course, remarked Heron, forming his own conclusions, and naturally enough, for his mind was now wholly occupied with Mr. Cass's promised revelation. Yes, about the case, said Mr. Cass again. I want you to give me your closest attention. And first, both of you must promise me to say nothing of what I have told you until I have given you leave. For the matter concerns a member of my family. And forthwith he plunged into the middle of the exciting history, and told it with as much detail as he could remember. It was necessary to make things perfectly clear to his listeners, as he relied upon their judgment to help him out of the cul-de-sac into which the whole affair was now wedged. At the conclusion of the story, Neil, who had been more or less excited throughout, although he had refrained from interruption, jumped up and began to pace the room. There isn't the slightest doubt, he said, that Job Lovell killed my father to get possession of that pocketbook. I thought you would say that, said Mr. Cass, drily. And what do you say, Heron? It seems probable that Job did kill the man, said Heron, with a grave nod. Marshall, you say, Mr. Cass, was in this house at the time. Your sister had got back to her bedroom. Now, only these two knew that the bill was in the pocketbook or had any interest in getting it. You forget Job. He knew all. Job must be the murderer, exclaimed Neil, with flashing eyes, and my mother is innocent. Now, she must be released. I will see to that, said Mr. Cass composedly. But you must let me manage the matter in my own way. I do not wish the rascalities of my precious brother-in-law made public. If Job can be proved guilty, he must be punished. In any case, As soon as we are certain of his guilt, Mrs. Jenner must be released." Mr. Cass paused, then added abruptly, "I hold you both to your promise." "If I had my way," said Neil, "I would go at once to Job and force the whole truth out of him. As it is, I shall not move in the matter until you give me permission. My mother told me to leave things as they were. You have asked me to do the same. I owe you too much, Mr. Cass, to break my promise." Mr. Cass, much affected by this speech, shook the young man warmly by the hand, then turned an inquiring eye upon Geoffrey, who answered the look. "I will do nothing, Mr. Cass, since it is your pleasure to thresh the matter out yourself. But I only warn you that Job may kill himself." "How do you mean kill himself on account of this murder?" "Maybe I don't know, but he is dying slowly and in much pain. His fellow gypsies will have nothing to do with him. He is too much of an outcast even for the Romany. I heard from one of my servants that Job, in a drunken humor, had threatened to put an end to himself by burning down the Turnpike House. In order to do this, I believe he has lately bought a large quantity of petroleum." "Ha!" exclaimed Mr. Cass suddenly. "I know. The house smelt terribly of petroleum. I dare say he has soaked the whole place in it, that it may burn the more quickly. What is to be done? The man seems to be in earnest. You must get his confession as to how he committed the crime." "That would be the best thing, no doubt," assented Mr. Cass. "But tomorrow I want to go up and see Mrs. Jenner. She seems to be very ill and wishes to see me at once." Heron had quite made up his mind that he would see Job the first thing in the morning, but Providence intervened with a sprained ankle. Returning home late from Hollyoaks, he was overtaken by darkness, and in some way how he could not explain, he stumbled and rose with an aching ankle, which next morning was so painful and swollen that his housekeeper begged of him to give himself a day's rest. But he declined this advice and managed to drag himself to the library. It was a dreary day, but towards the end the monotony was broken by the announcement of a visitor, and to his surprise, a figure in rusty black clothes was shown in a creature which smirked and grinned and rolled its head in a half-witted way. Geoffrey stared. "Jerry Hutt!" he exclaimed in surprise. "What are you doing in this galley?" "I am Mr. Hutt when I pay visits," said Jerry with dignity. "Only when I'm put upon at home by mother and master am I called Jerry." "Well then, Mr. Hutt," said Mr. Heron, humoring the strange creature, "I should like to know your business." "Take a seat." Jerry obeyed, first going through the ceremony of dusting a spotless chair so that his rusty suit might take no harm. He had furbished himself up for the occasion, and wore a flaring red tie as spruce as Julian Roper's green one, and as ill-suited to the person who wore it. In this was stuck a pin which, when he had seated himself near Geoffrey, the latter could see very clearly. It was an oval piece of gold adorned with the enameled figure of a ballet girl. While the unconscious visitor sat, smirking blandly on his chair, Mr. Heron rang the bell, and when the butler entered, spoke a few whispered words, upon which the man cast a startled look at Jerry and hurried from the room. In 3 minutes the door of the room half opened and closed again. Then Geoffrey knew that the under-footman, a strapping young giant, was waiting outside in case Mr. Hutt might be compelled to make a too hasty exit. "Well, Mr. Hutt," said Geoffrey, "what is it?" "I thought you were never going to speak," said Jerry, in an injured tone, "and I'm that hungry and dry, you wouldn't think. First we will have our talk, Mr. Hutt. Then I will see about having you provided with refreshment. Your errand. Quick!" "It was the master sent me here," Jerry said, becoming more respectful as he delivered his message. It was as though the spell of the sender were on him. "He bids me say that if you can give him that bill of exchange, he's willing to buy it." "That's very good of him," Geoffrey said, ironically. "And why does he want the bill of exchange you speak of?" Jerry nodded mysteriously. "I know, but I mustn't tell," he said. "You must tell, or I won't discuss the matter with you." "Well, it isn't a secret. Leastways, neither mother nor master said, 'Hold your tongue, Jerry.' I can say this much. That master wants to be upsides with that Mr. Marshall. You know why." "What do you know about Mr. Marshall?" Suddenly the smirking creature was transformed into a furious beast. "I know that he killed Miss Elsa." "He did," shouted Jerry, and the man outside was instantly on the alert to run in and aid his master. "Aye, she was a beauty, and he broke her heart. I hope to have made her Mrs. Jerry Hutt," he added with a sob, but that wicked Mr. Marshall, he had her put in the ground. I'll never see her again, but I want to lay him by the heels. I do, quite as much as Master does, and that bill of exchange will do it. Ah, you know all about the bill of exchange, then? Jerry nodded. I listened after you went away, and I know it was the same as they spoke of at the time of the murder. Ugh, he shivered. That were a gory murder, bless my soul. We will leave the bill alone for the time being, Jerry, and talk of something else, that beautiful breastpin, for instance. Where did you get the thing from, Mr. Hutt? Hutt blinked, quite pleased that Mr. Heron should admire his jewelry. I picked it up, he said, nodding. It wasn't a pin, but I made it one myself. And where did you pick it up, Jerry? He shook his head. I can't tell you that. He snapped and frowned. Well, I know that you picked it up not far from the Turnpike House, my friend, and that you dropped the other part of the link under the window. The window, gasped Jerry, turning almost blue with suppressed fear. Yes, the window of the Turnpike House through which you killed Jenner. Hutt stared blankly at him, his eyes starting from his head. Then he gave vent to a long howl like that of a beaten dog and slipped onto his knees. Oh, don't hurt me, he sobbed. I never did anything. I'll tell you all. I'm frightened, the master said. I'd be caught some day. Then you did kill him. Heron almost shouted. No, I didn't, snuffled the man. You can't hang me for not doing what I didn't do. Here, loosening the breastpin. You can have it. He threw it to Heron. I don't want to be put in jail. Please, please. His dim brain had seized upon the idea from the few words Heron had spoken that the gentleman knew all and could hang him. Chapter 29. The End of the Turnpike House. Perhaps had Heron attacked Jerry less suddenly, and had he not shown by a few chosen remarks that he knew a good deal, the half-witted creature might not have confessed. But his weak nature gave way altogether, and during the next half-hour Geoffrey turned him inside out like a glove. The story which Heron extracted from the whimpering creature was this: Roper had always suspected, and rightly, that Jenner had hidden the forged bill before he went to prison. When the man came out, he got to know the date of his discharge and set Jerry to follow him in order that he might see where he went to get the document. Jerry was on the track for many days and saw that he procured it from an old friend who, ignorant of its value, had taken charge of it. The document was in a sealed envelope, and Jerry had seen Jenner place it in a red pocketbook. All this he reported to Roper, and he was then ordered to follow Jenner and get it from him at all costs. Jerry got again on the track of the released prisoner and followed him down to Westham. In one way or another, the spy kept himself out of sight, for Jenner, having been Roper's clerk, knew the lad as he then was. The rest may be told in Jerry's own words, which were many and rambling. He got down here on a misty, rainy night, sir, he said, fiddling with his clumsy fingers, and I kept at his heels. At a wayside pub, he took victuals and drink. I watched the door from the other side of the road and ate what I had with me. I daren't go inside, lest he should see me. Didn't you lose him in the mist? Asked Geoffrey, who was listening eagerly. I never lose anything, sir, returned Jerry. I can see anywhere and foller like a dog. You don't slip me. I've had enough follering to do for the master. Well, Jenner, he goes to a large pool of water, the Wagoner's Pond. Go on. Oh, that's it, is it? I never knowed. Well, there he meets with Mr. Marshall. Oh, I knowed his voice. I was hiding near them behind a hedge. I was. And a ghost came past me. Sir, a ghost with a long black dress. Heron saw that the man was ignorant that Mrs. Marshall also had been listening, and this was all the better. It was as well that Jerry had taken her for a ghost. I hate him so, you see, explained Jerry. He killed Miss Elsa, and I was cruel fond of her. Well, them two was talking about the bill, and Jenner he shoot it to Marshall, but he wouldn't give it up till he got money for it. Marshall said he'd give him money when he was married and after that they parted. I tried to foller Jenner, but I thought the other Marshall would spot me. I didn't mind, though, as I knowed Jenner was going to the Turnpike House to see his wife. But you were a stranger. How did you know where that was? I had passed it in the afternoon, and from what Marshall said to Jenner, I knowed it was the Turnpike House. Well, sir, I scrambled a lot and got mixed. I don't know where I got. Then I heard a scuffle and a cry, and saw in the mist two men fighting. Marshall and Job, thought Heron. Then aloud, go on. I thought of someone else might be after the red book, so I was going to run forward when one cove, he slipped away and after groaning awful the other, he went too. He was shaken a lot by the fight. I stayed where I was for a time. Then I creeps forward and lights a match. What did you do that for? I wanted to see if in the fight the red book had been dropped. How was I to know that one of them wasn't Jenner in spite of his going on to the turnpike? When I cast a light, he resumed, I saw something glittering on the ground. It was a broken link, and I examined it by another match. There was 2 links. One piece was a champagne bottle, just as you said, sir, and the other was my pin with the girl. I thought they were pretty and saw they were gold, so I put them into my coat pocket. How did you lose them, then? Geoffrey asked, thinking this explanation perfectly feasible. I only lost one champagne bottle, said Jerry quite gravely, 'cause there was a hole in my pocket I knowed nothing of. The other I took home and got made into a pin. I never knowed, till you spoke, where I lost the one. Was it under the turnpike window? He inquired. It was found there, assented Heron. Jerry scratched his head. I must have shook it out when I was looking in at the window, he muttered. Oh, you did look in at the window, then? Of course I did, sir. Wasn't I following Jenner? After I picked up the links, I went straight to the turnpike, but didn't get there for a long time through having mistook the way. I see a light in the window, and I sneaks up to it through the bushes. The window was open, and Jenner, he was leaning against it. On a table, under the window, I saw a knife and the red pocketbook with the bill. Jenner was talking to himself and cursing some child. Poor Neil, muttered Heron. I waited a bit to steal the book when I heard Jenner give a yell and saw a kid come into the room looking frightful. He ran at Jenner, who gave a skip and dodged him. The child's eyes was like diamonds and fixed. I never seed anything like the looks of him in my born days. Jenner, he screeched again and pitched himself at the child to fall on top of him, leastways it looked like it. But I didn't wait. I saw my chance, and grabbing the pocketbook, I ran like a deer, I did. Just as I got a little way off a cove, jumped out on me, and collared my throat, singing out for the red book. I wouldn't give it up and shoved it deeper into my pocket. But he held me down with one hand and dug it out with the other. My heart, sighed Jerry, rubbing his hand. Didn't the master give me beans for not having that pocketbook? Didn't you know who robbed you? No, I wished I had known. I'd have got the book next week when the talk of the murder was past. But the master got a scare from that, though I told him, as I tell you, that it wasn't me. He said lie low, so I did lie low, and after a time he gave up the idea of getting the bill, till you came the other day, and he thought you might have it. So I've come to buy it if you will sell. We'll talk about that later, Jerry. Are you sure Jenner was alive when you left the window? I swear it. He was just making for the kid. Had he the knife in his hand? Not as I know, sir. I think it was on the table. Jenner just ran at the kid with his mouth open. He was in a cruel fright. But I cut and didn't wait to see anything. Then, do you think the child killed Jenner? Lord, no, sir, cried Jerry, amazed. A weak little thing like that. Besides, the kid hadn't the knife. 'Twas on the table, I'm sure. Can you guess, then, who killed him? No, sir, I can't. All I know is that I didn't. But now you know, just say if I'm to have the bill. I'll tell you tomorrow morning. I must know tonight. The master wants me back tonight. He can't have you then, said Heron drily. You stay here tonight. I want you to repeat your story to someone else. I won't then. I was a fool to tell, but I don't know nothing. You must stay here. I never killed him, wept Jerry. Then he turned sullen and made a grab at his hat. I'll go, he said, and made for the door. Stephen, called Geoffrey, and Jerry found himself face to face with a big footman who seized him with iron hands. Here, here, he shouted, struggling and roaring. Let me go. I never did nothing to Jenner. Let me go. Lock him up in some empty room, Stephen, cried Mr. Heron, and give him food and wine. He must be kept here all night. I will take the responsibility. Confound this foot. If I were only able to walk. Oh, I'll keep you, Mr. Hutt. We haven't done with each other yet. Jerry's cunning came suddenly to his aid, and he ceased struggling. If you give me grub and wine, I'll stop, he said. I ain't done nothing to Jenner, and I ain't afraid. Take him away, Stephen, and do what I tell you, said Geoffrey, sharply, and Jerry Hutt soon found himself locked in an outshed with a tray of food and a bottle of beer for his supper. At intervals, Stephen, the footman, came in to see that he was safe. The creature noticed this and made his plans accordingly. Immediately after Stephen had departed after one of these peeps, he scrambled up the rough woodwork and managed to get to the window, which was closed merely by a hasp, no one having the least idea that the man would attempt to escape. Jerry broke open the catch and soon forced his ungainly body through the opening. Not paying sufficient attention to his footing, he fell and alighted on a manure heap some distance below. "Spoiling my nice new suit," he grumbled as he groped round to get out of the yard in which he now found himself. There was some little difficulty about this, but he at last discovered a gate which led into a by-lane and was soon out of Mr. Heron's grounds, running across country for all he was worth, chuckling at the way in which he had outwitted his host. For quite 2 hours he wandered on, for he had completely lost his bearings. The night was fine with a high wind. The moon was at the zenith, and across her silver face passed cloud after cloud. At intervals the whole landscape became light as day, and he could see plainly. But he was a comparative stranger, though he had several times been down looking for the bill by his master's order. Suddenly he emerged on to a common overgrown with gorse, and found himself on a spot where 4 roads met. Some distance away, a white house looked spectral in the moonlight. "The Turnpike," he said aloud. "My gum! And there's the window I looked through. The light's in it now, too, just as it was when Jenner was killed. I wonder who's in there?" His curiosity got the better of his fear of Mr. Heron, and with a surprisingly light step, for the man was heavy, he crept through the jungle of bushes and sneaked along the wall of the house. "Just like old times," he said, chuckling. "I hope there ain't no more murders, though." Someone was singing a wild song in a drunken voice, and when the clerk peered through the window, for there was no blind, he saw a man dancing in the middle of the room. A cheap oil lamp was on the table, and by its light the dancer executed his fandango, waving a bottle as he did so. The apartment was bare, and a horrible smell of petroleum was wafted to Jerry's nostrils. In his curiosity, he forgot to keep himself concealed, and Job, for he was the dancer, saw him. He flung himself across the room, and before Jerry had realized his danger, the gypsy had seized him by the collar of his coat and was dragging him through the window. Come in, Satan," yelled the drunken man. "We'll have another murder." "Oh, let me go," screeched Jerry. But he was like a rabbit caught in a snare, and shortly found himself in a heap on a petroleum-soaked floor, while Job closed the window. Hut was terrified, but he could see no means of escape. "Have a drink," shouted Job, thrusting the bottle under Mr. Hut's nose. "You let me go," he whispered, clinging to a chair. "If you don't, my master will set the police on to you, see if you don't." "The police!" cried Job. "What do I care for them? They can't do anything to me. She'll keep them off, she will. I can shoe up her husband if she don't. Drink, or I'll kick you." Partly to avert the carrying out of this threat, and partly because he was extremely dry with his race across country, Jerry accepted the offer, and as the ardent spirits went down his throat, he felt his courage revive. "I'm Jerry Hutt," he exclaimed, "and I work for Mr. Roper. I want the bill." He made a grab at the gypsy. "It will lay him by the heels," he hissed. "Lay who by the heels? Hang you?" cried Job, pushing him back. "Why, Marshall, I won't call him Mr. Marshall, who killed my poor dear Miss Elsa." Job, half stupid with drink, had yet the sense to gather the meaning of the words. "Blessed if I won't know of the red pocketbook, too," he muttered. And even as he spoke, Jerry caught the words and repeated them. "The red pocketbook," he shouted. "Do you know where it is? The bill is in it, and I'll buy it off you. Oh, yes, I will. £50. Job banged his fist so heavily on the table that the lamp tottered. "I wish I had it now," he cried. £50, by gum." "Have you the bill there?" asked Jerry, taking another drink. "No, I haven't anything," said Job. "She got it out of me." "Got what out of you?" "Why, the red pocketbook, but the bill wasn't in it," he added. For a moment Jerry stared at the man, then dropped the bottle with a crash on the floor. It broke, and the liquor, forming a pool, added its fumes to the smell of the petroleum. "You had that red book," stuttered Jerry, trying hard to clear his brain. "And it was taken from me. You live here, you were you? Oh." He sprang from his seat with a roar. "You took it from me?" "Well," said Job with a growl, "was you the cove as I fought on that night, and knocked about so?" "You robber, you thief!" cried Jerry, crouching for a spring. "Give me back my property, the book, the bill, and he flung himself on the gypsy, who gave a cry of rage. "I'll crush you like a fly, as I did before," Job said, and grappled with his visitor. But Job was not the man he had been 12 years before. He could not hold his own as he had once done. Shouting and cursing, the two men swayed round the apartment. Finally, they crashed against the table and upset the lamp. It fell and burst on the floor. Immediately the woodwork, soaked as it was in petroleum, broke into flame, and in almost less time than it takes to tell, the whole room was in a blaze. With a yell of terror, Jerry tried to shake himself free and leaped through the girdle of fire, but Job held him fast. "No, you don't," he shouted. "You die with me, whoever you are. I've made arrangements for this. I never intended to live, but I thought I'd die alone. Now I've got you." And he made a clutch at Jerry's throat. After that, the struggle proceeded in silence, for Job held his peace, and Jerry could not cry out by reason of those two strong hands fast on his throat. By this time the room was blazing like a furnace, and the clothes of the two men were in flames. A frightened wayfarer saw the fire streaming towards the sky, saw two men vaguely struggling in the flames. Chapter 30. The Truth at Last. "It is not impossible," said Geoffrey, thunderstruck. Mrs. Marshall shook her head. "So possible that I always thought so myself," she said. "My own idea was the same," remarked Mr. Cass, who was the third person of the party now assembled in Mr. Heron's library. "I have told you several times, Geoffrey, that I believed Mrs. Jenner to be guilty." The young man drew a long breath. Even now he could scarcely credit the news. "So she really did kill her husband?" "There can be no doubt about it," said Mr. Cass, pointing to an envelope lying on the table. "There is a copy of her confession. She signed it in the presence of the chaplain and the governor of the jail." It was the morning after the burning down of the Turnpike House that this conversation took place. Information that two charred bodies had been found among the ruins had led Geoffrey to believe that Jerry had perished along with Job. Stephen had informed him on the previous night that the creature had made his escape, and no pursuit had been attempted. There was no doubt in Geoffrey's mind that Jerry had gone to see Job at the Turnpike House, but why he should have done so, and why it had come about that he and the gypsy should have met their deaths together, he could not think. Nor was the mystery ever cleared up. But if the death of Jerry remained a mystery, that of Jenner did not. Towards noon, Mr. Cass made his appearance together with his sister to see Mr. Heron. After some little talk about the fire, Geoffrey detailed what had been confessed to him on the previous night. "How did it all come about?" he asked now. "That's what I want to know," said Inez. "Sebastian has told me nothing beyond the bare fact as yet, because I want to tell the story once and for all, and then put it out of my mind," said her brother, solemnly. "You see, Heron, my sister and you both know all about this case. What you have told us about Jerry Hutt's visit supplies the last link which brings the crime home to Mrs. Jenner. I'm not going to tell anyone else how the murder took place. I have asked the governor and the chaplain not to tell Neil the truth when he goes up for the funeral. He has had enough trouble, poor boy. I, for one, do not want him to have any more. He believes now that his mother is innocent." "Oh, indeed," interrupted Mrs. Marshall, with a haughty curl of her lip. "And who does he believe guilty?" "Job, the gypsy. He thinks that the man set fire to the Turnpike House and destroyed himself, so as to escape the penalty of his crime. I think it only merciful that he should be allowed to remain under that impression." "I quite agree with you," said Heron, heartily. "And you, Mrs. Marshall?" She bowed her head. "I have no ill will towards the young man, although I hated his mother. But she has gone to her account, so I will say no more about her. As to Neil Webster, as he calls himself—" "And will continue to call himself," interposed Mr. Cass, sternly. "I will say nothing to him," continued Mrs. Marshall, taking no notice of this interruption. "I do not wish to visit the sins of the parents upon the children, but with one parent murdered and the other parent a murderess, I don't see how the young man can turn out well. And I sincerely hope that he will not marry that unfortunate Jenny Braun. If he asks her to marry him, she will not accept him blindly," said Mr. Cass, "for I intended to tell her the whole story, suppressing the fact that Mrs. Jenner was guilty." "That is well," put in Geoffrey. "But I should like to hear the story of Mrs. Jenner's crime." "I can tell it to you in a few words," said Mr. Cass. "The clerk's tale has brought the story up to the time when Jenner flung himself on the child. Well, Mrs. Jenner heard his cry and rushed down into the room. Jenner was mad with rage at the uncanny hatred shown to him by his own son, and had him by the hair of the head, shaking him as a terrier does a rat. Mrs. Jenner rushed at him. She thought he would kill the child. They struggled, and he struck her. While this was going on, she found herself near the table, and seeing the knife, blindly snatched it up, throwing her husband to one side. Then, clutching the child to her breast and holding out the knife to keep off the infuriated man, she tried to make her escape from the house. But Jenner was blind with fury, both against the child and against his wife who had instilled such hatred into the mind of the boy. He rushed at her. She cried out that she was holding the knife, but he took no notice of her and ran up against the blade, which buried itself in his heart. He fell, and his wife fainted with the insensible child in her arms. It was when she came to herself some time afterwards that she recalled what she had done. But it was by accident that she had killed him, and this she swore most solemnly. She denied that she had ever intended murder. Then she fled from the house into the darkness until she fell insensible under a hedge. The rest you know? Mrs. Marshall laughed again at this account. I believe she killed him on purpose, she said. She had every reason to do it, Mr. Cass said coldly, but all the same, I believe she has spoken the truth. Jenner died by accident. If this is so, said Geoffrey slowly, and I see no reason to disbelieve it, why did Mrs. Jenner tell Neil that she had killed his father? I asked her that, and her answer was that she was afraid if Neil reopened the case, some evidence might be brought forward to prove that she had really committed the murder. She had told her son that she was innocent, and she did not wish him to learn the truth. It was only on my giving a promise not to tell him that she consented to make the confession. She wants him to think of her only as a mother who loved him, not as a murderess. Humph, remarked Geoffrey doubtfully. A queer way of shewing her love, to put it into the head of an imaginative, neurotic creature like Neil that he himself was guilty. It will not do him any harm, said Mr. Cass. I don't pretend to say that I approve of her clearing her own name at the expense of Neil's peace of mind. But it is not for us to judge, and before she died she repented of having made that statement. Did she know how the red pocketbook was stolen? Asked Geoffrey abruptly. No, she had been so busy struggling with Jenner for possession of the child, she said, that she took no notice of anyone at the window. That was why Jerry, as you say, was able to put his hand in and take the book. It was lucky for the clearing up of the case that Jenner had sewn the bill inside the toy horse. If Roper had got hold of it, he would have made it hot for Marshall. He hates him like poison on account of— I have heard enough of that story, interrupted Mrs. Marshall. And you seem to forget, Sebastian, that if the bill had really been in the pocketbook, I should have got it through Job. I am tired of it all. I hope it is all ended forever. Yes, Inez. You will hear no more about it. In a few days, Mrs. Jenner and her story will be buried, and we will all try and forget the past. Neil must never know. I shall not tell him. Nor I, said Mrs. Marshall, with, for her, remarkable generosity. No one knows the truth but ourselves, and we will keep silence. What about those poor wretches who have been burnt? Well, Geoffrey must tell how Jerry Hutt came to see him, and in some way we must prove the remains to be his. After all, the corpse, what is left of it, may not be Jerry. I think it is, said Heron. Indeed, I am certain of it. I expect he and Job got quarreling about the bill, and Job set fire to the house in order to burn them both. Jerry did not burn willingly, I am sure of that. Job no doubt detained him in the burning house until it was too late. Mrs. Marshall shuddered. Job, indeed, was wicked, as well she knew. But now she was relieved from his blackmailing, and had only her husband to deal with. And she resolved now that she was in possession of the bill to make short work of him. Her thoughts still seemed inclined to separation and the Romish church. Well, goodbye, Geoffrey, Mr. Cass said, shaking hands. I hope your ankle will soon be right. Ruth is coming over to see you. But, remember, not a word to her. Not a word, said the young man. But I say, Cass, if I were you, I should burn that copy of the confession. The original, in the possession of the authorities, will be sufficient to prove Mrs. Jenner's guilt should anyone else be accused, which is not likely after all. Burn it? I intend to do so. And Mr. Cass dropped the document into the fire. I only brought it back so that you might be sure she was guilty. Ah, It is in ashes already. I wish we could get rid of all our painful memories so easily. But to the end of my life, I shall never forget this case." And these were the last words they spoke on the subject. For both Mr. Cass and Geoffrey ever afterwards carefully avoided all mention of it. Nor was there even the Turnpike House to remind them of the tragedy, for it had been burnt to the ground. And Mr. Heron had the site plowed and enclosed in the field adjoining, so that the next year corn waved where the blood-stained habitation had stood. Mrs. Marshall carried out her intention of separating from her husband. She gave him a portion of her money and made him a present of the forged bill, and he betook himself and his money to Paris. Neil buried his mother and mourned her for many months. Then he made his reappearance in public and was more successful than ever. Now that time was healing his wounds, he began to think about his future, and the first thing he did was to ask Jenny Braun to share it with him. She, poor girl, accepted him with joy, and at once sent the good news to Ruth. Mr. Cass thereupon went up to London and called upon the girl at his daughter's house, for she was still teaching Mrs. Chisel's children. He told her the whole story, not thinking it fair that she should marry Neil in ignorance of the truth. And at first she was horrified, but declared that nothing could alter her determination to marry him. "I love him," she said, and that was all. The strange story of the burning of the two men, and that of the murder which had taken place in the same house 12 years before, is even now often told by winter firesides. But few know the truth, that the mother of Neil Webster, the famous violinist, was the guilty person in the tragedy of the Turnpike House. The truth was disclosed to Mr. Cass, to Geoffrey Heron, to Mrs. Marshall, and to the governor of jail and the chaplain. But as for this story, it is told with other names, and the scene is laid 50 miles from the real locality. And with that, we reach the conclusion of The Turnpike House by Fergus Hume. After twists, turns, and shocking revelations, the mystery surrounding the house has finally been unraveled. Secrets have come to light, justice has been served, and yet the eerie presence of the Turnpike House will linger in our imaginations. I hope you enjoyed this thrilling journey. If you did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more classic audiobooks. Your support helps keep these timeless stories alive. Let me know in the comments what you thought of the mystery. Did you predict the ending, or did it take you by surprise? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next audiobook adventure.